Welcome to the channel Stories to Relax. I'm Bento, and here we take things gently, letting the mind slow down as we dive into fascinating stories, told at just the right pace to help you relax, or maybe even drift off to sleep. If you prefer a softer narration, try setting the playback speed to 0.8. Let us speak plainly. The world was about to receive a significant, utterly humbling shock. The Roman Empire, or what was left of it, now known by the slightly less catchy moniker of Byzantium, had developed a severe case of historical arrogance. After nearly 1,000 years, the powerful assumed their walls were impenetrable, their imperial taxes inevitable, and their very existence simply eternal. So unfortunately for the purple-robed bureaucrats polishing their gold plate in Constantinople, Destiny had booked a very loud, very unpleasant meeting with a force they hadn't bothered to catalogue. Out of the vast, unforgiving deserts, a place the polished indoor Romans usually deemed suitable only for minor skirmishes and regrettable geography lessons, came a terrifying, cohesive wave. These were not the disorganized barbarians of old seeking warm blankets and wine. These were tribes united by a powerful fervor and a purpose utterly alien to the old imperial sensibilities. The borders, those carefully drawn lines on expensive parchment that everyone took so seriously, were suddenly revealed as nothing more than flimsy suggestions. The earth around the Great Sea began to rumble, not with tectonic shifts, but under the terrifying hooves of an unstoppable cavalry. Cities that had stood for 600 years fell in a matter of mere weeks. Byzantium, the supposedly eternal structure, now faced its most unexpected and devastating enemy. To survive this seismic, unforgivable moment, to avoid becoming a mere footnote in the sands of time, they wouldn't just need better armies and sharper spears, they would need to utterly dismantle their former complacent self and be painfully, terrifyingly reborn. To grasp how an empire built to last a glorious 1,000 years suddenly found its foundations replaced by very expensive, rapidly dissolving sand, we must travel back a mere handful of decades. The critical error that led to the coming devastation wasn't tactical, it was psychological. The Imperial Romans of Constantinople had spent centuries perfecting the art of managing decline and minimizing losses, convinced that they were still the main event and that the universe revolved around their opulent palace politics. They assumed that their ancient problems were the only problems. Their grand mistake, committed in the decades leading up to the terrifying storm that swept in from the deserts, was an utterly self-inflicted strategic masterpiece. They were, quite literally, fighting two impossibly demanding existential wars simultaneously, wars which bled them whiter than the whitest marble in the imperial treasury. In the east, there was the ancient, deeply personal and highly dramatic rivalry with the Persian Sassanid Empire. This was less a geopolitical conflict and more a centuries-long sibling squabble fought over who got the better chunk of the Near Eastern inheritance. Emperor Heraclius had recently won a series of truly epic victories against the Persians, a feat so utterly taxing it likely gave every imperial accountant in Constantinople permanent, crippling migraines. These were victories purchased at the absolute maximum retail price: emptied treasuries, ruined provinces, and legions of professional soldiers who were utterly, irrevocably exhausted. Meanwhile, to the north and west, the empire wasn't enjoying a restful vacation either. For years, they had been grappling with the various Slavic and Avar hordes who treated the Danube frontier less as a border established by divine imperial right and more as a convenient, slightly challenging speed bump on the way to sacking rich cities. So, imagine the triumphant scene. Byzantium had just won the world war of its generation. The mighty Persian Empire was broken, its leadership scattered. the northern threats were temporarily subdued. The capital naturally broke out the finest imperial silks and the most robust celebratory wine. They sincerely believed the job was done. They were the undisputed eternal champions. This is precisely where historical irony performs its wicked little dance. By achieving total victory over their two primary centuries-old foes, the Byzantines had inadvertently created a massive, fragile vacuum. They were triumphant, yet financially ruined and militarily spent, much like a marathon runner who sprints the final mile only to collapse 5 feet from the celebratory banner. The great, unforgivable folly of the early 7th century is that when the utterly unexpected enemy rode out of the forgotten corners of the Arabian Peninsula, Byzantium had virtually nothing left to defend itself with. They had spent every single penny, every experienced man, and every ounce of strategic energy ensuring their old rivals were defeated. They never paused to consider that beating enemy A and enemy B might simply open the door for enemy C, an enemy they had never bothered to categorize, let alone fear. They were safe, they thought, and that belief, that profoundly expensive arrogance, was the final fatal preparation needed for the swift, sudden and complete rewriting of the world map. The victory parade in Constantinople was, to put it mildly, sensational. For decades, the empire had been performing a complicated, agonizing, and ultimately exhausting dance of death with their ancient rivals, the Sassanid Persians. And then Emperor Heraclius, a man who had started his reign looking like a freshly whipped servant and finished it looking like an avenging, though deeply tired Messiah, had done the unthinkable. He had delivered a knockout blow. The city, still smelling faintly of the ashes left by the previous sieges, erupted in a manic frenzy of relief. The streets, typically navigated by stern-faced bureaucrats and nervous merchants, were suddenly rivers of purple, crimson, and gold. They dragged the true cross, miraculously recovered from the Sassanid clutches, through the Golden Gate, setting off a wave of pious exhilaration that masked a far less savory truth. The victory was beautiful, iconic, and absolutely bankrupting. The problem with defeating a mortal enemy that has consumed every waking strategic thought for centuries is that once they are gone, you realize your entire economy was built around preparing for the next round of fisticuffs. Now that the enemy was officially horizontal, Byzantium faced an even scarier foe, the imperial balance sheet. Imagine attending the most exclusive, spectacular party of the century. The champagne flowed, the music soared, and you were declared the undisputed champion of the known world. Now imagine the lights flick on at dawn, revealing the dreadful reality. The house is on fire, the furniture is smashed, and the only things left in your wallet are lint and 4 unpaid bills dating back to the reign of Justinian I. This was the structural reality of the Roman world in the early part of the 7th century. They hadn't just fought a war, they had fought the war. Emperor Heraclius, a man whose willpower deserved its own column in the Roman pantheon, had purchased this peace at a truly astronomical price. He had spent years riding from one end of his battered dominion to the other, dragging reluctant legions into battle, and performing astonishing logistical feats of campaigning deep into enemy territory. He had been magnificent, yes, but he was now 48 years old, looking 60, and utterly drained of the youthful vigor necessary to fix the mess he had created through excessive success. Victory had not just been expensive, it required liquidating the national assets. Churches had been generously relieved of their precious metals, a decision made under the polite pretense of national security, but which amounted to the single largest imperial pawn transaction in history. Every piece of silver, every gold chalice, every intricately worked offering plate, gone melted down to pay the mercenary payroll and the staggering costs of feeding an army hundreds of miles from the nearest supply depot. The provinces, particularly those in the Fertile Crescent, which had been the main staging grounds for the conflict, were utterly flattened. They were not merely struggling, they were functionally non-existent as sources of imperial revenue. A Roman province under Sassanid occupation, then violently wrestled back by Roman legions, was essentially a wasteland of scorched earth and resentful peasants. Try asking a farmer whose village has been sacked twice in a decade, first by your enemy and then by your liberator, to produce 500 pounds of wheat for the imperial tax collector. He would, quite reasonably, tell the collector exactly where to stick his parchment and his demands. The Byzantine state, vast and ostensibly invincible on paper, was suffering from acute strategic anemia. The blood had been shed on the plains of Persia, and there was simply nothing left in the circulatory system to maintain the empire's enormous perimeter. One could almost pity the imperial accountants back in Constantinople. They were the ones charged with solving a geopolitical problem using nothing but extremely sharp quills and copious amounts of red ink. Their offices, usually places of serene, parchment-rustling calm, must have resembled a particularly gruesome scene from a theatrical tragedy. The legions, those tough professional soldiers who had survived the frozen eastern winters and the blistering desert marches, were heroes, but heroes who had not been paid in full for 3 years. They were holding sheafs of imperial IOU, scarce elegantly written promises from the emperor that were about as valuable as old bath tickets in the current financial climate. The sheer logistics of paying and demobilizing a victorious army proved to be the Achilles heel of the glorious peace. Veterans demanded their land, their pensions, and their back pay, and rightly so. But there was no money, and the most logical and cheapest solution was deemed to be rapid demobilization. In the south and east, the regions bordering the immense silent stretches of the Arabian Peninsula, the garrisons were stripped down to the bone. After all, the Persians were gone. Why waste good, exhausted troops and non-existent funds guarding a border that hadn't seen real trouble since the reign of Diocletian? This decision, the massive simultaneous reduction of forces across the eastern frontier, was not malicious or stupid in isolation. It was the inevitable conclusion drawn from the impossible equation of maximum debt and maximum fatigue. They simply couldn't afford to keep the lights on, and the soldiers armed everywhere simultaneously. The Byzantine High Command looked at the old maps. The problem areas were the Danube, Avars, Slavs, and Mesopotamia, Persia. With Persia now nullified, the threat matrix was, in their minds, substantially reduced. The Arabian flank was low priority, managed mostly by semi-autonomous Christianized client tribes like the Ghassanids. These Ghassanids were the Roman buffer state, an arrangement of mutual backscratching where Rome provided gold sometimes and titles always, and the Ghassanids provided the messy, exhausting work of policing the deep desert borders against their fellow nomadic tribes. It was a perfect, efficient system, or it had been. The subtle, unforgivable mistake made in Constantinople was their absolute refusal to understand that history never stops moving, even when you are exhausted and need a nap. The imperial staff treated the desert like a featureless blank space, a region where nothing strategically interesting ever happened. They were suffering from a terminal case of geographical arrogance. To them, the world consisted of Constantinople, Rome, the great rivers, and the civilized, silk-laden territories of their main rivals. The desert was merely the uninteresting space between the interesting places. Why concern themselves with the internal squabbles of the various Arab tribes, whom they vaguely condescended to as Saracens? a term meaning little more than tent dwellers or guys from the east. The great irony is that while the Byzantines and the Persians were engaged in their monumental, high-stakes slugfest, burning up the entire strategic oxygen supply of the Near East, something extraordinary was coalescing in the desert interior. The very act of achieving total victory over Persia was the historical trapdoor. Both Byzantium and Sassanid Persia, through sheer maniacal commitment to destroying one another, had successfully pulverized the political infrastructure of the Middle East. They had destroyed the client kingdoms, devastated the supply lines, and exhausted the local populations. They had, in short, created a colossal power vacuum. Had Persia remained strong, the rise of the Arabian power would have been checked immediately by a cohesive, centralized, and aggressive imperial state. Had Byzantium not been financially crippled, they would have had the resources to quickly stamp out any localized uprising. But the unique, terrible alignment of the stars in the early 600s meant that neither empire possessed the will, the manpower, or the funds to address the emerging storm. Heraclius, weary from his grand victory tour, returned to a capital choked with debt and administrative chaos. His attention was immediately diverted to fixing the systemic issues, restructuring the shattered provinces, reforming the military administration, a process known as the theme system, which was a desperate attempt to localize defense, and most critically, finding a way to pay for it all without melting down the emperor's crown. He wasn't sitting idly. He was deeply engaged in saving the empire from internal collapse. But this level of deep internal focus meant his strategic lens was turned inward. He saw the immediate threats, the Avar remnants in Thrace, the theological disputes that threatened to rip the Egyptian provinces apart, and the simple grinding struggle against poverty. The reports from the far south were treated with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. Isolated raids, minor incursions, these were the normal background noise of a turbulent frontier. They required merely a few letters to the local Dux military governor, instructing him to deal with it swiftly and without requiring additional funds. The few astute observers who noted the unusual coordination, the terrifying speed, and the religious fervor of the raiding parties emerging from the desert were dismissed. They were prophets of doom, alarmists who didn't understand that the real problems lay in the halls of power, not the desolate wastes of Syria. The fatal structural weakness of Byzantium was not its lack of faith, or its political infighting, or even the shortage of gold. Its weakness was its utter blinding self-absorption. They could not conceive of an enemy that did not behave according to the established Roman or Persian rules of engagement. An enemy that wasn't interested in conquering a city to install a friendly governor, but an enemy that aimed to fundamentally rewrite the religious and social contract of the entire region. They were accustomed to wars fought over borders and trade routes. They were utterly unprepared for a war fought over the very nature of existence. As the first waves of mobile, highly motivated desert warriors began to test the enfeebled Roman defenses in the Levant, the Byzantine military machine responded slowly, ponderously, like a magnificent but rusting engine sputtering to life after a 10-year hiatus. The commanders sent south were often veterans of the Persian Wars, men who understood siege warfare and massive set-piece battles. They did not understand swift cavalry-based hit-and-run tactics, nor did they understand the terrifying motivation driving these newcomers. The Roman assumption was simple. These were disorganized barbarians who would loot a bit, perhaps be bought off, and eventually scatter. The Roman solution was therefore tactical, localized, and underfunded. It was a minimalist approach to what turned out to be maximalist global change. The Emperor Heraclius, the magnificent victor, the man who had resurrected the fortunes of Rome against the mighty Shahanshah, was looking at his old enemy's corpse, while the actual, entirely new threat was already marching through his undefended back door. The stage was set not by an enemy's strength, but by the empire's self-inflicted strategic masterpiece of exhaustion. Byzantium, having sacrificed everything for victory, now stood triumphantly on the precipice of ruin, gazing back at the defeated ghost of Persia, utterly oblivious to the hurricane gathering speed in the silent, forgotten sands just beyond their view. It was historical irony of the highest order, a victory so complete it ensured the loser's replacement would be not just another empire, but a whole new world order. The long nap they desperately needed was about to be interrupted by the most aggressive, most unwelcome wake-up call imaginable, delivered by highly mobile troops carrying very sharp swords. For centuries upon glorious gold-plated centuries, the Byzantine Empire, and before it the proper original Roman Empire, had viewed the Arabian Peninsula with the amused condescension reserved for a mildly annoying, perpetually dusty, distant relative. It was, they assumed, the great vacuum cleaner of the East, a place where troublesome ideas went to die of dehydration and where organized society dissolved into bickering tribes obsessed with camel pedigree and the location of the nearest, slightly less salty watering hole. The established powers, Byzantium in the west and the newly defeated but still deeply sophisticated Persians in the east, knew how the world worked. Power flowed from the fertile plains, from the great river valleys, and from cities where one could procure proper silk and affordable bureaucracy. Power did not, under any circumstances, bubble up from the shifting sands where the average lifespan of a political alliance was roughly the duration of a particularly fierce dust storm. This utter conviction in the desert's irrelevance was perhaps the single greatest strategic oversight in the history of the Mediterranean world, surpassing even the famous Roman mistake of thinking just one more barbarian tribe to buy off, or the Persian error of believing that Emperor Heraclius would eventually just give up and go home. What the Romans utterly failed to grasp was that their own exhaustive decade-long war of attrition with the Sassanids had not just bankrupted both empires, it had, unintentionally, hilariously, created the perfect political and strategic vacuum for an entirely new kind of actor. While Constantinople and Ctesiphon were busy checking each other into intensive care, the back room, the dusty pantry, was being meticulously swept clean and prepared for a party no one expected. The catalyst, as is so often the case in history, was neither gold nor grain, but an idea. A very simple, very powerful, and extraordinarily unified idea. Before the seismic shift, the Arabs were certainly a pain. They were fierce fighters, excellent horsemen, and prone to raids that occasionally disrupted trade, like a persistent housefly buzzing around a banquet. But they were predictable. They fought over the usual things: status, lineage, vendettas that stretched back 6 or 7 generations and were maintained primarily because nobody could remember the original insult, and, critically, resources. When a tribe launched a raid, they were looking for immediate, tangible rewards: some livestock, perhaps a few pieces of jewelry, or a temporary advantage over a neighboring clan. The goal was localized enrichment, not strategic reorganization. Their military effectiveness was limited by their fragmentation. One moment they might unite for a particularly juicy piece of looting. The next, they might be stabbing each other over who got the better cut of camel meat. They operated on what might be called the $5 target principle. They would not risk their necks for a kingdom, but they would happily risk everything for a few sacks of dates and the sheer glorious thrill of tribal warfare. Then, everything changed. The introduction of the new faith, Islam, did something terrifyingly effective to the traditional social structure of the Arabian Peninsula. It didn't just give them a new set of prayers, it gave them a centralized, non-negotiable mission statement, and perhaps more importantly, a single chain of command. Suddenly, the feuds that defined their existence were obsolete. The old tribal deities, the ancient scores, the obsession with who owned which well, all faded into the background when faced with the absolute universal authority of a singular divine mandate. The energy previously spent squabbling internally was now harnessed and focused outward with the intensity of 1,000 converging magnifying glasses. If the Byzantines looked south and saw merely a collection of quarrelsome nomads, they were looking through an outdated telescope. The desert was no longer a collection of tribes, it was an army, molded by a discipline that was entirely spiritual and therefore exponentially stronger than any discipline enforced by a centurion's whip. The brilliance of the early Rashidun military was its rejection of all the things the major empires held dear. The Byzantines and Persians measured success in expensive supply lines, massive siege engines, carefully polished armor, and voluminous scrolls detailing imperial protocols for everything from tax collection to the proper way to address a minor provincial governor. Their logistics were complicated, slow, and cripplingly expensive. The new Islamic force operated on a principle of radical austerity and dazzling speed. They didn't need complicated logistics because they were fighting from the desert, not into it. Their supply lines were shorter, their needs were fewer, and their traditional means of transport, the camel, was infinitely superior to the slow-moving Roman carts and heavily armored cavalry when operating in the Levant's unforgiving terrain. Imagine a Byzantine general, a man accustomed to the glorious organized chaos of a massive army of 20,000 men, each with their designated baker, their specialized weaponsmith, their quartermaster, and their 5 or 6 personal attendants. He received intelligence reports filtered through several layers of paranoid bureaucracy, eventually learning that an enemy column of perhaps 3,000 riders had appeared. Where? From the empty quarter? Impossible. That's just sand. Yet there they were. This new force was fundamentally disciplined, not by the fickle loyalty of local duces or the threat of a cruel imperial executioner, but by a belief system that treated every single action, every skirmish, every deployment as a spiritual duty. Death was not merely a defeat, it was a guaranteed promotion. This is a terrifying motivation for an opponent accustomed to fighting mercenaries who, upon realizing they might actually perish, promptly decided to negotiate terms or simply run home. The early commanders of the Rashidun, figures like Khalid ibn al-Walid, who would earn the highly complimentary albeit terrifying moniker, the Sword of God, were tactical geniuses unburdened by tradition. They didn't feel obligated to fight massive set-piece battles just because that was the proper way to wage war, according to the ancient Roman handbooks. They were masters of the ghazwa, the raid, but elevated to a grand strategic level. Hit the weakest point, scatter the enemy, melt back into the desert before reinforcements could arrive, and then reappear 200 miles away, freshly provisioned 2 days later. To the Byzantines, this felt less like warfare and more like being attacked by extremely motivated ghosts who refused to stay in one place long enough to be properly counted, let alone defeated. The unification also solved the biggest problem inherent in fighting tribal armies, the tendency to immediately scatter after victory, to hoard the loot. Under the new unified leadership of the Caliphate, the spoils of war were centralized, regulated, and distributed according to a clear, established system. This meant that the men stayed in the field. They trusted the system because it was based on shared faith, not on the whim of a greedy warlord. This simple bureaucratic refinement, the systematization of plunder, was as important as any battlefield victory. It transformed a transient raiding force into a standing army that could campaign continuously. Consider the contrast. A Byzantine army, having secured a victory, would spend weeks dealing with payroll issues, fighting over who was responsible for the local taxes, and debating whether the quality of the local wine merited a special imperial communiqué. Meanwhile, the Rashidun forces, after their own victory, would pray, gather the spoils with efficiency, and immediately begin studying the next map coordinates. Their operational tempo was unprecedented. For the Roman governors stationed in the Levant, the intelligence reports must have been baffling, if not deliberately misleading, because who would believe such nonsense? "Your Excellency," a nervous scout might report, trembling slightly, "they do not loot the entire city. They take only what is necessary for the campaign, and they have strict rules against wanton destruction of churches or farming land. They simply ask for tribute and then move on." "Nonsense," the governor would bellow, adjusting his magnificent but stiflingly hot purple silk tunic. "Barbarians always destroy everything. That is their nature. They must be using subterfuge. They are probably hiding the loot beneath the sand and will return later." The Roman mind struggled to compute an enemy that exhibited both military brutality and organizational restraint. They were accustomed to one of two modes: a civilized opponent, Persia, who fought according to mutually understood rules of engagement, or a savage one, various northern tribes, who simply burned everything in sight. This new enemy was both, religiously savage in their conviction, but clinically disciplined in their execution. The most profound effect of the Rashidun unification was the radical remapping of the strategic geography. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the periphery had become the center. The great Byzantine fortresses lining the Limes Arabicus were designed to face east, watching for the lumbering, predictable approach of a Persian army. They were not built to sustain coordinated continuous attacks from the south, where the maps simply dissolved into blank parchment labeled "Here be very thirsty people." The desert was no longer a barrier, it was a sanctuary and a military highway. When the Caliphate decided to launch an invasion, they weren't constrained by the need to secure coastal trade routes or paved roads. They used the vast empty spaces, the very thing the Romans considered their safety buffer, as their operational base. If a Byzantine army was too slow, the Rashidun simply bypassed them, marched swiftly through the dry interior, and reappeared near a vital city far north, forcing the slow-moving imperial troops to choose between abandoning their fortifications or attempting a desperate, exhausting chase through terrain entirely unsuitable for their heavy infantry. It was a masterclass in strategic judo, using the opponent's own weight and preconceptions against them. The Byzantines were masters of the established world, relying on fixed points, known lines of communication, and established intelligence networks. The Rashidun were operating on fluid geography and pure improvisation backed by absolute commitment. The Emperor Heraclius, still basking in the glow of his spectacular victory over the Persian Shahanshah, still celebrating the return of the true cross to Jerusalem, was about to discover that cleaning up the neighborhood only works if you pay attention to the new tenants moving in. He had defeated the most powerful, most entrenched enemy he knew. Now he faced an enemy he literally could not conceptualize, an empire born in the shadow of faith, traveling faster than rumor, and utterly uninterested in playing by the rules of the decadent, exhausted world it was marching to replace. The quiet, forgotten sands were now humming with purpose, and that purpose was nothing less than the conquest of the world's two greatest empires. The Roman military machine was about to be hit by a perfectly coordinated blitzkrieg, launched from a place they had always assumed was too busy complaining about the heat to organize anything more complex than a small-scale family barbecue. If the Emperor Heraclius thought his spectacular triumph over the Persians meant he could finally sit back, enjoy the Mediterranean breeze, and perhaps commission a new series of flattering mosaics, the universe was about to offer him a swift and rather rude correction. He had successfully cleaned out the attic, only to discover the foundations of his house were dissolving beneath his feet. The initial reports arriving in Constantinople were, naturally, dismissed as administrative noise. They spoke of rapid incursions, small bands of highly mobile cavalry, and unsettling reports of perfectly disciplined infantry appearing where no one sensible had planned for infantry to be. The imperial staff, accustomed to the lumbering political dance of the Persians, who always announced their arrival with sufficient diplomatic fanfare and heavy siege engines, filed these reports under local banditry, severity mildly annoying. The key failure of Byzantine intelligence was a monumental inability to distinguish a raid from a rolling conquest. They saw the Caliphate's forces initially as mere desert scouts, eager for plunder and perhaps a bit of mischief before retiring back into the blinding anonymity of the Arabian Peninsula. After all, the Byzantines possessed the Limes Arabicus, that magnificent line of forts designed specifically to manage this kind of dusty inconvenience. What the strategists in Antioch and Damascus failed to grasp was that the desert was no longer a barrier to the invaders. It was their best friend, their logistics train, and their secret weapon. While the Byzantine quartermasters agonized over transporting enough grain and water to support their heavily armored cataphractoi, the imperial heavy cavalry, magnificent in appearance, but wholly impractical for a desert sprint. The Caliphate's soldiers lived off their wits, dried dates, and a conviction that the angels were watching their supply chain. They moved with the terrifying speed of men who had nowhere to retreat to, and nothing to lose but the heat stroke. The resistance failed because it was founded on an obsolete map. The Byzantine garrisons were fixed points in a rapidly shifting geography. Their entire strategy hinged on the invaders respecting the paved roads and traditional siege warfare. The Caliphate, under brilliant commanders who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to coordinate movements across vast, desolate spaces, a trick the Romans still couldn't fathom, as it required actual trust and synchronized commitment, not just imperial decree, simply refused to play the game. Imagine, if you will, the plight of the Byzantine general stationed comfortably in a magnificent fortress, surrounded by stone walls thick enough to resist a decade of Persian battering. He would receive intelligence that an army of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 had been spotted 30 miles to the south. He would gather his forces, polishing his bronze, preparing his men for a glorious counterattack the following day. When they finally marched out, fully prepared for a set-piece battle, they would find nothing but shimmering heat haze and the tracks of fast-moving camels. Then the general would receive frantic reports that the original 3,000 or 4,000 men had not only vanished but had reappeared 100 miles to the north, having entirely bypassed his fixed position and were now enthusiastically dismantling the defenses of a vital, undefended town. The Roman High Command was perpetually forced into an impossible choice: hold their magnificent, useless fortifications and watch the empire bleed out around them, or chase the enemy across treacherous, thirsty terrain, thereby exhausting their massive, expensive armies and rendering their heavy cavalry useless. It was like trying to swat a persistent, incredibly agile fly with a solid gold hammer, entertaining to watch perhaps, but strategically disastrous. Key cities like Bosra fell in the year 634. Damascus followed shortly thereafter, not because the fortifications were weak, but because the defenders simply could not believe that an army could arrive so quickly, sustain a siege with such ferocity, and yet somehow maintain an incredibly flexible line of retreat. The irony was magnificent. The Romans had perfected military bureaucracy, but the Caliphate had perfected military impulse. Heraclius, viewing this unfolding catastrophe from the safe, luxurious distance of Antioch, was beginning to run out of patience, and more worryingly, out of excuses. He had spent 10 years restoring the Roman East after the Great Persian trauma, and now a new enemy, arising from a place labeled by geographers as mostly sand and regrettable decisions, was undoing all his hard work in a matter of months. His advisors naturally blamed the local governors, the quality of the regional wine, and of course the inadequate level of imperial funding, never once pausing to consider that the enemy might actually be better at this particular flavor of warfare. Finally, the emperor decided that enough was enough. This was no longer a question of border raids requiring a stern lecture and a few hundred punitive troops. This required the full, glorious, overwhelming might of the Roman Empire, deployed with all the heavy metal glamour they could muster. Heraclius resolved to crush the invaders in one massive, undeniable blow. He marshaled the entirety of the Eastern Field Army, dragging forces from Armenia, calling up the semi-loyal Ghassanid Arabs, and incorporating vast contingents of heavy Gothic, Slavic, and European mercenaries. This was to be the Great Eastern Army, a host so large, so diverse, and so intimidating that the enemy, when they finally saw it, would surely turn tail, realizing they had accidentally wandered onto the wrong continent. The estimates of the size of this force vary wildly, as military historians love to bicker over the precise number of men required to lose a decisive battle, but it was certainly immense. 100,000 men, perhaps more, a truly staggering collection of iron leather and cultural misunderstandings. Command of this colossal, sprawling force was given not to one man but split amongst multiple generals, a decision that smelled suspiciously of internal Byzantine politics and the emperor's fear that one successful general might harbor ambitions of becoming the next emperor. This shared command was a tactical disaster, waiting patiently for a place to happen. The various commanders, chiefly Vahan the Armenian, supported by Theodore Tritherius and the Ghassanid leader Jabala, spent more time debating strategy in five-star tents than they did coordinating maneuvers in the field. The Roman army marched south, a slow-moving, magnificent river of men and material, burdened by the weight of imperial expectation and an entirely unnecessary amount of baggage. They were seeking the decisive field, intending to drive the invaders back into the dusty oblivion from whence they came. The Caliphate forces, significantly smaller but unified under the formidable leadership of Khalid ibn al-Walid, a man whose military talent was so profound it often seemed entirely unfair, realized they could not face this monumental Roman machine in an open field slugfest. They needed terrain that negated Roman weight and favored mobility. They chose the arid plains bordering the Yarmouk River. The site was less a glorious battlefield and more an ecological disaster waiting to happen. It was a barren plateau marked by deep ravines, scorching heat, and the notoriously difficult terrain of the Golan Heights. It was a place designed to make marching miserable, supply lines fragile, and communication impossible. For the heavy, cumbersome, and internally fractious Byzantine army, it was a death trap dressed in desert camo. The two armies faced each other for weeks, a tense, brutal standoff that stretched from mid-July into late August of the year 636. The sheer logistical strain on the Byzantines was crippling. They were hot, their water was scarce, and the endless internal bickering among the various ethnic contingents was corrosive. The Slavs mistrusted the Armenians despised the Arabs, and the Romans simply wished everyone would quiet down and respect the chain of command. Conversely, the Caliphate army, while fewer in number, perhaps 40 or 50,000, a ratio of 2 to 1 against the Romans, operated with almost silent efficiency. They knew the territory, they knew the heat, and most importantly, they knew why they were there. Their commitment was absolute, fueled not by imperial salary, but by deep religious conviction, creating a level of morale and discipline the overpaid, weary Byzantine mercenaries simply could not match. The final battle, lasting 6 excruciating days, was less a single engagement and more a series of brutal, coordinated hammer blows designed to exploit the Roman army's structural weaknesses. The fighting was characterized by devastating mobility and relentless psychological pressure. The Byzantine army deployed a long static line, hoping to use their weight to simply grind the enemy down. But Khalid refused to engage the line frontally. He utilized his light cavalry, expertly trained in flanking maneuvers and feigned retreats, to systematically collapse the Byzantine wings. On the 3rd and 4th days, the fighting became horrific. Roman morale was shattered not just by the enemy, but by their own internal conflicts. When some Byzantine units, primarily the mercenaries, began to retreat under heavy pressure, they often found their escape route blocked by other Roman units, unwilling to sacrifice their own position, or worse, by their own officers, who, in acts of desperate cruelty, reportedly had the retreating troops executed to prevent a rout. Nothing destroys the desire to fight quite like realizing that your own side might kill you before the enemy gets a chance. The true moment of defining terror arrived on the 6th day. The Byzantine army was already exhausted, dehydrated, and compressed against the steep, unforgiving ravines of the Yarmouk. Khalid launched a final coordinated assault, utilizing the terrain as his 11th general. The Roman line, heavy and unable to pivot swiftly, buckled. Thousands of Byzantine soldiers, trapped against the narrow riverbanks and the sheer-sided wadi, faced a terrifying choice: fight the disciplined, charging enemy or fall into the deep, rocky ravines behind them. The resulting slaughter was comprehensive. The Great Eastern Army, the pride and final military hope of the Roman East, was not just defeated, it was utterly destroyed. It was a demographic catastrophe for the empire. Historians estimate that the losses were upwards of 70,000 men. The generals were killed, captured, or vanished into the dusty chaos. The Battle of Yarmouk was more than a military victory. It was a geostrategic supernova. It instantly and irrevocably redefined the balance of power in the Near East. In the aftermath, Syria, that vast, wealthy, and historically crucial Roman province, was wide open. There was no longer a field army capable of opposing the caliphate. The remaining garrisons, scattered and terrified, quickly realized that resistance was not only futile but professionally suicidal. City after city fell in swift succession. Jerusalem, the spiritual heart, held out briefly before surrendering. Antioch, the great capital of the East, was next. When the news reached Heraclius, he was crushed. The victory over the Persians, his life's defining work, now seemed like a cruel, short-lived joke played by fate. He had secured the eastern border only to lose the entire east. Legend holds that the emperor, preparing to depart Antioch and retreat to the safer, more familiar waters of Anatolia and Constantinople, gazed back at the lands he was abandoning. He saw not a defeated enemy, but a world fundamentally transformed by a speed and commitment he could not replicate. His recorded lament, perhaps apocryphal but certainly reflective of the moment, was the final, mournful, imperial admission of failure. Farewell, a final farewell to Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy. He wasn't merely saying goodbye to a province, he was saying goodbye to 1,000 years of Roman dominance in the Levant. The quiet hum of purpose that had begun in the sands had grown into a roaring storm, and the storm had swallowed the eastern half of the Roman world whole. The center of gravity had decisively shifted south, and the exhausted, decadent empires of the ancient world were now facing a long, slow curtain call. The dust of Yarmouk had barely settled. In fact, it hadn't settled at all, merely drifting across the scorched earth of the Levant as a massive airborne memorial to Roman hubris when the remaining Byzantine garrisons of Palestine received the news. The reports arrived not through efficient military channels, but carried by demoralized, wounded, and frequently hysterical survivors who looked less like soldiers and more like ghosts wearing expensive armor. The truth, stark and uncompromising, was this: there was no army left. The Great Eastern Army, that magnificent tapestry of troops drawn from every corner of the empire, Armenians, Syrians, seasoned Thracians, had been dissolved into the ravines and rocky slopes of the Yarmouk Valley. The Emperor Heraclius had beaten a hurried, sorrowful retreat to the safety of Anatolia, having delivered his magnificent, mournful goodbye to Syria. This left Palestine, the land most saturated with spiritual significance, utterly exposed. The local Roman command structure promptly did what any self-respecting bureaucracy does when facing existential crisis. It seized up completely. The small garrisons protecting cities like Caesarea, Gaza, and most crucially Jerusalem found themselves performing a bewildering calculation. Should they attempt to hold out in small, isolated fortresses? Should they try to muster a relief force that demonstrably did not exist? Or should they simply accept that the grand imperial experiment in the Levant had reached a sudden, violent, full stop? The answer, driven home by the speed and discipline of the encroaching forces of the Caliphate, was depressingly clear. City after city, realizing the folly of resisting an enemy that had just obliterated a force 3 times their size, began the grim process of negotiation. It was not a grand campaign of sieges and assaults that conquered Palestine. It was a campaign of inevitable economic and military logic. Why die for a remote emperor who had clearly decided that the eastern provinces were simply too costly to retain? But Jerusalem. Ah, Jerusalem. The city was unlike any other. It was not merely a provincial capital or a military stronghold. It was the sacred hinge upon which the entire spiritual identity of the Eastern Roman Empire turned. Its walls, while robust, sheltered not just panicked soldiers, but the holiest sites in Christendom. To lose Antioch was a disaster. To lose Jerusalem was an apocalypse. At the heart of this unfolding spiritual nightmare sat Sophronius, the patriarch of Jerusalem. Sophronius was not a battlefield commander, but he was a formidable man of letters, a theologian of immense repute, and a spiritual giant whose entire worldview was fundamentally rooted in the absolute divine right of the Roman Empire to rule over the Holy Land. For him, the arrival of the Arabs, whom he saw as uncouth desert-dwelling barbarians, a term he used often, perhaps unwisely, was not a political inconvenience, but a satanic challenge to the correct ordering of the cosmos. When the Caliphate's armies, commanded primarily by the shrewd Amr ibn al-As, arrived at the gates of the Holy City, the atmosphere was thick with conflicting pressures. The Muslim forces were disciplined and confident, buoyed by the monumental success at Yarmouk. But they were also pragmatically aware that a long, costly siege against a heavily fortified city was an unnecessary drain on resources. Sophronius, meanwhile, had enough food stored to survive a grueling siege, but he lacked the essential ingredient required for resistance: soldiers who actually wanted to fight. The Byzantine troops still manning the ramparts were, by and large, residents of the region who had heard the stories of Yarmouk and developed a sudden, overwhelming respect for self-preservation. The siege, therefore, became less about battering rams and more about a tense, philosophical stare-down. Amr ibn al-As, known for his political acumen perhaps more than his military genius, knew how to turn the screw without resorting to unnecessary bloodshed. He simply encircled the city, cut off the supply lines, and waited. Inside the walls, the tension was unbearable. Sophronius delivered passionate sermons, reminding his frightened flock of the city's destiny, invoking the ancient promises, and condemning the invaders as ephemeral enemies who would soon be swept away by God's wrath. But God's wrath, unfortunately, seemed to be moving at a painfully slow pace. While the Arab patrols outside the walls were decidedly quick and effective, weeks bled into months. The scarcity of fresh supplies began to bite. The garrison looked increasingly ragged. Sophronius, observing the grim reality, realized he held one final magnificent card: the spiritual integrity of Jerusalem itself. He was ready to negotiate, but he would not surrender to a mere general, however victorious. That would be an insult to the dignity of the new Rome Constantinople, and more importantly, an insult to the sacred history contained within the walls. Sophronius issued his demand, relayed through anxious intermediaries and translators. Jerusalem would surrender, but only to the supreme leader of the invading armies, the Caliph himself. This was a profoundly cheeky move. It was the ultimate desperate act of a man trying to inject imperial grandeur into a moment of humiliating defeat. Sophronius essentially declared, "You may have defeated our army, stolen our province, and humiliated our emperor, but you are not worthy of this city until your most important personage shows up and confirms that we are dealing with a power of comparable seriousness." The demand traveled south, across the dust-choked desert paths to Medina, the burgeoning center of the nascent Islamic State. It landed upon the desk, or perhaps the sand-covered mat, of Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph. Umar was, to put it mildly, the polar opposite of the gilded, cultured, and tragically burdened Emperor Heraclius. Heraclius was a creature of the sophisticated, decaying world of Byzantium. Umar was a man of radical simplicity, severe piety, and terrifyingly practical administration. He dressed simply, often in patched clothes, scorned luxury, and viewed the opulence of the Roman and Persian empires as sinful displays of misplaced priorities. When the demand arrived that the supreme temporal and spiritual leader of the conquering power must personally travel hundreds of miles to accept the surrender of one city, Umar was initially amused, then thoughtful. It was an inconvenience, certainly, but he instantly grasped the symbolic magnitude of the request. This wasn't merely about taking a city, it was about confirming the shift in global authority. To deny the request would be to devalue the prize and risk further bloodshed. To accept it was to stamp the legitimacy of the caliphate onto the greatest spiritual prize in the Roman East. So, the caliph agreed. He prepared for his journey to Jerusalem with a complete lack of fanfare, which, ironically, made the entire undertaking far more impactful than any emperor's parade could have achieved. Picture the scene. While the Roman world expected an emperor to travel with thousands of cavalry, Immense baggage trains carrying silver plate and purple silks, and hundreds of cooks dedicated to ensuring the imperial stomach was not offended by local cuisine, Umar arrived with startling minimalism. Legend, which often tells a better truth than history, insists that Umar traveled either alone or with a single attendant. Even more amusingly, they allegedly shared a single camel, taking turns riding and walking. It's hard to imagine a starker contrast to the Roman imperial standard. One day, Umar would be walking, his cloak dusty, leading the camel. The next, his attendant would be doing the same. This wasn't a show of poverty, it was a profound statement of austerity, an almost deliberate rejection of the norms of established, decadent power. When he finally reached the outskirts of Jerusalem, the pragmatic, battle-hardened Muslim commanders were initially horrified. Here was the leader of the faithful, looking less like a supreme ruler and more like a Bedouin who had misplaced his tent. Amr ibn al-As and the others reportedly scrambled to find the caliph a suitable steed, maybe some cleaner clothes, perhaps even a banner to make him look suitably imperial. Umar refused. He rode into the area of his awaiting troops and then prepared to enter the city looking exactly as he was, simple, unadorned, and supremely powerful. The moment of confrontation, or rather, the moment of symbolic transfer, was heavy with historical weight. Sophronius, the cultured, refined patriarch, stood waiting, likely decked in the heavy, perfumed vestments of his office, surrounded by the nervous remnants of Roman administration. He was accustomed to the dazzling, gold-plated ceremonies of the imperial court. He expected a meeting of equals, a Roman-style negotiation carried out under banners and silver trumpets. What he saw approaching the gates of the city was a man whose simplicity was startlingly radical. Umar was tall, stern, and carried the undeniable aura of command, but his garments were plain, possibly even torn in places from the journey. He radiated a focused, intense dedication that made the silk and gold of the Roman representatives look instantly flimsy and theatrical. Sophronius, watching this dusty figure approach, reportedly murmured, quoting the biblical passage, "Truly, this is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place." It was a profound insult, certainly, but it also revealed Sophronius's genuine horror. He wasn't horrified by military defeat. He was horrified that the new masters of the world seemed utterly uninterested in the traditions of civilization as he understood them. They had no interest in the pomp, the hierarchy, or the sophisticated philosophical arguments that buttressed Roman rule. They possessed only a terrifyingly direct faith and commitment. The surrender itself was conducted with the meticulous administrative focus that characterized Umar's rule. There was no theatrical burning of city standards or ritual humiliation. Instead, the two leaders, the man who embodied the failing Christian empire and the man who embodied the rising Islamic State, discussed terms. The result was the famous Pact of Umar, a covenant guaranteeing the rights of the Christian inhabitants, their property, and crucially, the sanctity of their holy sites. Sophronius secured protection for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Christian population in exchange for a fixed tribute, the jizya. This arrangement, while humiliating to Roman pride, was remarkably fair by the standards of the time, guaranteeing the continuation of Christian life in the Holy City, but the spiritual loss was immeasurable. The sight of the caliph entering the city, accepting the keys not as a conqueror bent on vengeance, but as an administrator asserting dominion, marked the official end of Christian control over Jerusalem, control that had been largely unbroken since the Emperor Constantine. Umar's most symbolic act occurred shortly after the surrender, Sophronius invited him to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in Christendom. Umar refused. His reason was stunningly pragmatic and deeply respectful of the long view. He explained that if he prayed inside the church, future Muslim generations might claim the right to convert the church into a mosque, thereby violating the terms of the treaty and potentially leading to conflict. Instead, Umar prayed outside the building on the steps, and it was there that a small mosque, named the Mosque of Umar, was eventually constructed. A permanent visible demarcation line that honored the covenant while proclaiming the new reality. The spiritual trauma reverberated across the remaining Roman world like a bell tolling for the deceased. Losing Jerusalem was the ultimate psychological blow. For Constantinople, for the pious Empress Martina, and certainly for the exiled Heraclius, the defeat at Yarmouk was a military catastrophe, but the fall of Jerusalem was a theological scandal. It meant that the earthly realm of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection was now governed by non-Christians. The ultimate stage of the faith had been seized. The cross, the symbol that had defined the Roman victory over Persia just 15 years prior, was now subject to the whims of the new caliph. This wasn't merely a political setback. It introduced a profound crisis of faith. Had God abandoned the Romans? Had the great campaigns of Heraclius securing the true cross been pointless? The answer, as far as the imperial court was concerned, was that they must have sinned grievously to warrant such a punishment. This loss fueled decades of intense introspection, theological squabbling, leading to new heresies naturally, because Romans loved nothing more than arguing about divine details while the empire crumbled, and a desperate internal need to purify the empire before God would return his favor. Heraclius, safe now in his capital, far from the choking dust of the Levant, could feel the enormous weight of this spiritual burden. He had survived the Persian Wars, he had defeated the ultimate nemesis, and yet in the space of half a decade, he had watched the entire edifice of Roman spiritual and territorial authority in the East crumble. The quiet triumph of Umar in Jerusalem, a triumph achieved not through extravagant violence, but through stern, uncompromising humility, sealed the deal. The old verbose and gold-encrusted world was being replaced by a new, focused and rapidly expanding power driven by an engine of devotion that the weary, overtaxed Roman system simply could not match. Sophronius, the stubborn, cultured patriarch, died shortly after the surrender. He had watched the old world die and the new world be born, and he did not wish to stay for the difficult, complicated transition. His final, desperate demand for the caliph to appear had ironically ensured that the spiritual transfer of power was stamped with an authority so unique and unforgettable that it secured its place in history, confirming that the spiritual heart of the East was no longer beating for Rome. The curtain had fallen on a millennium of Roman dominance in the Levant, replaced by the austere shadow of a man who preferred a single camel to 1,000 horses. The spiritual theater had closed in Jerusalem, marked by the quiet, disciplined prayers of a caliph whose austerity shamed the gilded excesses of the Roman world. The spiritual heart of the East, long in critical condition, had flatlined. But empires, unlike people, do not die from a single broken heart. They die from starvation and hemorrhage, and the ultimate hemorrhage was now about to begin. If Jerusalem was the empire's soul, Egypt was undoubtedly its stomach, its lungs, and its primary source of income. For centuries, stretching back to the Caesars of Rome, Egypt had been the ultimate prize. It was the vast, fertile delta of the Nile, a place where the soil was so rich that simply sneezing on it often resulted in a bumper crop. It was the great agricultural engine of the Mediterranean. the indispensable granary, whose annual grain shipments kept Constantinople fed, subsidized its armies, and filled the imperial treasury with the hard currency necessary to keep the machinery of government grinding, albeit rustily. To lose Egypt was not merely a territorial setback, it was an extinction-level event for the Roman economy. It was the equivalent of losing both your checking account and your oxygen supply simultaneously. The man entrusted with this apocalyptic task was Amr ibn al-As, a commander who had the necessary blend of sheer military cunning and highly sophisticated opportunism. Amr was, in short, a pragmatist who understood the value of surprise and the overwhelming fatigue of his enemy. He looked at the vast, desolate stretches of the Sinai separating him from the Nile Delta and saw not an insurmountable obstacle, but an invitation. The decision to strike Egypt, made in the early 640th year of our Lord, was audacious, bordering on suicidal. By all metrics of classical warfare, the campaign was wildly under-resourced. Amr's force numbered perhaps 4,000 men. Some reports suggest slightly more, but the crucial point is that it was a force suitable for a raid, not the sustained conquest of one of the most densely populated and strategically defended provinces in the known world. Yet, this small number was itself a weapon. It gave Constantinople the luxury of disbelief. Emperor Heraclius, still reeling from the Jerusalem trauma and likely suffering from the severest case of military burnout in history, could scarcely believe that anyone would be foolish enough to attempt such a feat with so few troops. Ah, Alexandria, the pearl of the Mediterranean, the city of learning, the magnificent metropolis that represented the apex of Hellenic culture, blended with Roman power. If Constantinople was the political capital, Alexandria was the fiscal and intellectual heart that pumped lifeblood throughout the East. It was where the taxes were tallied, where the papyrus was manufactured, and where the mountains of grain awaited shipment. Amr, leading his small, tough band, struck first at Pelusium, the easternmost key to Egypt. This initial success, achieved quickly, sent a tremor across the Nile. But the Byzantines were not defeated by military might alone. They were defeated by internal betrayal and, far worse, profound theological infighting. Remember, the Romans loved a good theological fight more than they loved paying taxes or, apparently, defending the frontiers. Egypt was overwhelmingly Monophysite Christian. This sect held a different view of Christ's nature than the official Chalcedonian dogma mandated by Constantinople. For generations, the imperial capital had done a magnificent job of alienating its Egyptian population through relentless persecution, forced conversions, and installing deeply unpopular Chalcedonian bishops, or patriarchs as they were grandly titled, to rule over a populace that despised them. Enter Cyrus. Cyrus, the patriarch and de facto governor of Egypt, was a Chalcedonian zealot installed by Heraclius to enforce doctrinal purity, a task he performed with ruthless efficiency and zero diplomatic skill. To the Coptic majority, Cyrus was less a benevolent governor and more the chief enforcer of a foreign theological occupying power. When Amr arrived, the local Egyptians did not necessarily see him as a liberator, but they certainly saw him as a preferable alternative to Cyrus and the crushing weight of Constantinople's doctrinal tyranny. The choice was not between good and evil, but between two forms of oppression, one familiar and religiously hostile, the other foreign but religiously indifferent, at least initially, to their specific Christological preferences. This internal rift proved fatal. Cyrus had spent so much effort trying to crush heresy that he forgot about the much more pressing problem of defending the empire. The Arab forces, bypassing heavy fortifications, moved swiftly toward the key defensive fortress known as Babylon of Egypt, near modern Cairo, which sat strategically at the intersection of the Delta and Upper Egypt. This fortress was the true gateway. Its defenses were formidable, its walls thick, and its garrison substantial. Amr knew that a direct assault would be costly, perhaps ruinous. This is where cunning replaced brute force. The siege lasted for several months. Imagine the arid heat, the relentless sun beating down on the walls, and the slow, grinding realization within the Roman camp that no relief was coming from Constantinople. Back in the capital, Emperor Heraclius was a shadow of the man who had dragged the true cross back from Persia just 10 years earlier. He was unwell, exhausted, and psychologically shattered. The campaigns had cost the treasury everything. The tax base was already collapsing in the east. Now, with the threat to Egypt, the possibility of complete financial ruin loomed like a terrifying, malnourished vulture. The bureaucracy in Constantinople, meanwhile, operated at the speed of molasses on a cold day, debating the proper deployment of funds while the bread was literally being pulled from the imperial table. The situation was perfectly encapsulated in Heraclius's alleged reaction when he finally received news that Amr's small army had successfully moved deep into Egyptian territory. He was said to have burst into a terrifying fit of fever, convinced that God had truly forsaken him. He could allocate neither the men nor the money needed for a large counterattack. He had defeated the Sassanids, the oldest and grandest enemy of Rome, only to be undone by a force that emerged seemingly from nowhere, motivated by a fierce, austere faith that operated outside the comfortable, predictable rules of diplomacy and warfare the Romans understood. The fate of Babylon Fortress was sealed not by the strength of the siege engines, but by the weakness of the defenders' morale and the toxic ambition of Cyrus. Cyrus, realizing the game was up and likely prioritizing his own safety and influence over the collapsing empire, entered into secret negotiations with Amr. The audacity of this governor, negotiating the surrender of a key Roman province while the emperor was still alive and technically in charge, speaks volumes about the utter breakdown of Byzantine authority. The terms of the surrender were astonishingly practical and focused entirely on the transfer of resources. On April the 9th, in the year 641, the fortress of Babylon fell. The terms included an annual tribute, a guarantee of Christian protection, and the agreement that the Roman garrison would depart Egypt entirely. Crucially, the treaty ensured that Roman authority south of Babylon immediately ceased. The immediate consequence was not a battle, but a logistical catastrophe in Constantinople. Egypt had been shipping approximately 200,000 metric tons of wheat annually to feed the capital's population and support the army. This flow of cheap, reliable, subsidized grain was the bedrock of social stability in the city. The moment Amr took control of the logistics, that flow stopped. Immediately. The silence from the Egyptian ports must have been deafening in the capital. One day, the grain ships arrived. The next, they did not. The resulting shock was immediate and brutal. Food prices skyrocketed. Riots, suppressed only by the fierce remaining defenses, became commonplace. The very foundations of the Byzantine economic model, based on controlling key agricultural territories to subsidize the political center, had been ripped out from under it. It was one thing to lose a province that generated taxes. It was quite another to lose the province that fed your core population. It meant that the emperor was now directly responsible for the impending famine, a situation that terrified the population far more than the distant threat of Arab armies. Amr, a man who understood logistics, did not need to conquer every speck of sand in the vast province to secure victory. He controlled the Nile and the major administrative centers. With Babylon secure, he held the choke point. The rest was a slow, inevitable process. Alexandria, though immensely fortified and technically capable of holding out, was now strategically irrelevant because it was cut off from the internal Egyptian supply chain. It became a siege defined by apathy and despair. The magnificent city, the crown jewel of the Mediterranean, held out for a painfully long time, over a year, but the spirit was gone. The logistical reality was unassailable. Constantinople could not dispatch the fleet, and the armies needed to relieve the siege. Heraclius was too busy dealing with the internal chaos of famine, illness, and the grim realization that his lifetime's work had disintegrated into dust. Heraclius died shortly before the final collapse of Alexandria. It was an ending of profound historical irony. The man who had saved the empire from the greatest threat it had ever known, Persia, died watching it crumble in slow motion from an unexpected, previously unimaginable power. His death in February of the 641st year threw Constantinople into immediate dynastic turmoil, featuring a brief, poisonous rule by his widow, Empress Martina, and their son, followed by a succession struggle that left the capital entirely incapable of mounting a serious defense of Egypt. While the Byzantines squabbled over who should wear the purple, a color now severely lacking in Egyptian dye exports, one might add, Amr took Alexandria. The city fell in the late 641st year, or perhaps the early 642nd year, depending on which chronicler you prefer, but the precise date matters less than the consequence. With Alexandria, the Romans lost the entire western half of their empire's economic backbone. The wealth generated by Egyptian taxes, which had subsidized the imperial army, was now diverted entirely to the coffers of the caliphate. The grain, which kept the masses quiet, was gone. The papyrus, which kept the imperial bureaucracy running, dried up. The spiritual defeat at Jerusalem had signaled the end of Roman dominance in the place of Christ. The fall of Egypt signaled the end of Roman dominance in the purse of Rome. The remaining Byzantine Empire, now reduced essentially to Anatolia, Greece, and the Balkans, suddenly found itself financially crippled, starving, and surrounded. It was a stunning transformation from world power to struggling survivor in the space of less than a decade. From this point forward, Constantinople would not be able to afford the grand, complicated, slow-moving armies of antiquity. The loss of Egypt forced a brutal, immediate, and utterly painful simplification of the state, a transformation from a vast, bureaucratic, world-spanning empire into a lean, mean, highly centralized city-state fighting simply to exist. They had been pruned down to the bone, and the prognosis was bleak. The old world of marble, gold, and philosophical debate was over. Now only iron, starvation, and survival mattered. Amr ibn al-As, the clever commander who started with only 4,000 men, had achieved the impossible. He had not just conquered a province, he had financially gutted the greatest empire in the West, ensuring that the Roman challenge to the caliphate would remain weak and desperate for centuries to come. It was the most economically devastating military defeat in Roman history, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective weapon is simply cutting off the food supply. And with the fertile lands of the Nile now flowing into the Islamic treasury, the new power had the resources to fuel its expansion for decades. The once mighty Byzantium was now on a strict and involuntary diet. The grand golden stage of the Roman Empire, which had stretched across 3 continents and stood for more than a millennium, had just suffered the historical equivalent of a sudden, brutal amputation without anesthetic. The fall of Alexandria, confirmed sometime in the early months of the 642nd year, though frankly, who was keeping accurate calendar when the world was ending, was not merely a military defeat. It was a cosmic joke delivered with a cruel punchline. The punchline, of course, was poverty. Absolute, immediate, grinding poverty. Constantinople, the celebrated city of the world's desire, suddenly felt less like the heart of civilization and more like an extremely expensive, isolated marble island floating in a sea of encroaching dread. The contrast was stark and historically delicious in its irony. Just 2 decades prior, the Emperor Heraclius had been riding high, having decisively defeated the great king of Persia and restoring the true cross to Jerusalem. The empire was, for a fleeting moment, whole and glorious. Now, thanks to the stunning speed and efficiency of the forces mobilized under the new caliphate, they had lost Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and most damningly, Egypt. The accountants in the Great Palace, typically a nervous and fastidious bunch, were now in a state of catatonic shock, staring at ledgers filled only with zeros where columns of Egyptian gold once shone. The loss of Egypt was not just the loss of a province. It was the loss of the entire machine that made being Roman affordable. Imagine, if you will, being the owner of the world's most luxurious fuel-guzzling chariot, only to discover that the entirety of your bank account has been spontaneously emptied and your primary source of oil has been handed over to your most aggressively ambitious neighbor. That was Constantinople in the mid-700s, the bureaucracy, famed for its glacial speed and complexity, seized up entirely. The Romans were masters of paper, or rather papyrus, and suddenly the flow of that essential administrative substance, harvested exclusively from the banks of the Nile, dried up completely. High officials, accustomed to endless reams for their verbose decrees, were reduced to scraping older parchment or, heaven forbid, actually being concise. The sheer horror of the situation was probably enough to send 3 dozen scribes into early retirement, or perhaps just a very long nap under a pile of useless expense reports. The empire, in the space of less than a decade, had lost roughly 3/4 of its traditional landmass, and critically, 4/5 of its revenue. We are talking about 75% of territory gone and 80% of the treasury vanished. It was, as any good accountant would tell you, a non-viable business model. The emperor, currently the young and beleaguered Constans II, who had the unenviable job of being 12 years old when the world began to truly fall apart, was faced with a terrifying, irrefutable truth. The grand inherited structure of the late Roman state was now an unsustainable liability. Let us observe the plight of Theodore, the prefect of the sacred treasury, a man whose ancestors had once presided over vaults so full of gold that their very existence was said to cause inflation in neighboring kingdoms. Theodore now presided over magnificent but utterly empty chambers, echoing faintly with the sounds of his own despair. Theodore was a stout man, fond of the old ways, which involved complicated seals, 13 different forms for approving a load of fish, and the general assumption that his office would always smell faintly of money and expensive olive oil. Now, his office smelled of cheap Anatolian wine and panic. He sat hunched over a map, a vast thing made of hammered silver, which now mocked him mercilessly. He traced the lines of the lost provinces with a trembling finger, marveling at the sudden, catastrophic shrinking of the known, civilized world. 75%, he muttered to his equally grim secretary, Photius, a skinny man who specialized in doomsaying. 75% of God's earth gone, and yet the paperwork demands remain at 100%. Photius merely adjusted his spectacles, which were now held together with a hastily manufactured bronze clip, because imported glass was getting frightfully expensive. The forms, my Lord Theodore, must be filled. The Emperor has decreed the organization must continue. It is the Roman way. The Roman way, Theodore grumbled, stabbing his finger somewhere near the Aegean coast, used to be financed by the infinite fertility of the Nile Delta. The Roman way involved legions paid in gold, fed on subsidized grain, and clothed in fine linen. What is the Roman way now, Photius? Starvation and complicated unfunded mandates? The reality was crushing. The loss of Egyptian grain meant the end of the free bread dole for the massive, hungry population of Constantinople. The grain ships simply stopped arriving. When the belly rumbles, revolution is rarely far behind, a historical truth that Constantinople's rulers were keenly and nervously aware of. The crisis demanded not merely adaptation, but a surgical, self-inflicted revolution of governance. The empire could no longer afford to be a late Roman state, with its vast, overlapping civilian hierarchies, its layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, and its rigid separation of military and civil power. That structure was designed for an era when money was limitless and invasions were slow. The new reality was that the enemy was fast, highly motivated, and absolutely everywhere. The Emperor Constans II, guided by advisors who understood that this was not merely a temporary setback, but an epical realignment, was forced to dismantle the accumulated administrative wisdom of 5 centuries. It was not a popular endeavor, like telling a highly organized person that they must burn their filing cabinets and use the ashes for fertilizer. The old system, perfected by Diocletian and Constantine, divided the empire into massive prefectures, which were then broken down into dioceses, which were further subdivided into provinces. This complex tapestry of civilian governance was meticulously separated from the military command structure. A general could not interfere with the tax collector, and the tax collector could not tell the general where to march. This separation was the hallmark of enlightened, cautious Roman rule, designed to prevent any single person from usurping too much power. But efficiency was now far more valuable than cautious stability. With the frontier collapsing inward, the remaining imperial territory, essentially the peninsula of Anatolia, Asia Minor, and the Aegean Islands, plus the Balkans, had to be transformed into a gigantic, fortified camp. There was no longer any room for delicate civil-military separation. Theodore watched with a mix of horror and relief as the old provincial governors were stripped of their authority. The civil structure, that grand, glorious engine of paperwork, was being shelved or perhaps simply left to molder in the absence of papyrus. In its place, a radically simplified system was emerging. The remaining territory was being carved up into huge defensible military districts. These were vast tracts of land, not administered by a gentle civilian official, but ruled directly by the strategos, the general. The strategos was now judge, jury, tax collector, and army commander, all rolled into one efficient, highly dangerous package. This was an astonishing reversal of Roman principle, a necessary capitulation to the terror of the moment. The bureaucracy had been replaced by the barracks. The ledger had yielded to the sword. This was the birth of the thematic structure, though the people living through it only knew it as the great scramble for survival. The old legions, which used to be paid quarterly in gold from the Egyptian tax revenue, were now useless artifacts. The empire couldn't pay them, and they couldn't be expected to defend a 1,000-mile frontier purely out of patriotic duty. The solution was brutal, necessary, and elegant. Give the soldiers land. The remaining Byzantine territory was portioned out to soldiers and their families. They were granted tracts of Anatolian land, not as a gift, but as an obligation. Their pay was the land itself, and their primary duty was to live on it, farm it, and crucially, defend it with their lives the moment the invaders appeared. They were citizen soldiers, tied inextricably to the soil they defended. Their livelihood was the frontier. This transformation was not smooth. The surviving aristocrats and land-owning elites who had suddenly found their cozy estates overrun by surly, sword-carrying military families were aghast. Their pleas and complaints, however, were drowned out by the metallic clang of necessity. The emperor could not afford to listen to ancient land titles when the very existence of the state hung by a thread thinner than a starving scribe's quill. The new map of the world was profoundly unsettling to the inhabitants of Constantinople. Before, the map had radiated out from the Golden Horn, incorporating the sun-drenched coasts of North Africa, the Fertile Crescent, the vastness of the Balkans, and the rich plains of Italy. Now, the map seemed to be a defensive huddle. The empire was reduced essentially to a colossal, jagged fortress built around the Anatolian plateau. The sea, the internal, friendly Mediterranean, was now a hostile expanse across which enemy fleets could launch themselves. The old maritime highways were becoming dangerous waterways. The capital itself became the single, indispensable nucleus. Everything revolved around the Theodosian walls. Constantinople was not just the seat of government, it was the entire imperial reserve, the last operational shipyard, the only major source of industry, and the final repository of Roman gold, what little was left. The psychological shift was perhaps the most profound. They were no longer the undisputed masters of the world, benevolently presiding over a vast, rich dominion. They were the besieged, they were the survivors, they were the ones scratching out a meager living while surrounded by implacably hostile forces. The air in the capital was thin, heavy with the scent of wood smoke replacing the perfumes of imported spices. Everything was local, everything was immediate, and everything was utilitarian. The gold was being melted down, not for new crowns, but for immediate military expenditure. Even the magnificent artistic output of the capital, the mosaics and the silverware, began to reflect the austerity. Function overruled beauty. The magnificent, slow-moving administrative beast of Rome had been forced quite literally by starvation to shed 2/3 of its body mass, leaving behind a lean, muscular, and highly centralized military republic disguised as an empire. The transformation was ugly, painful, and deeply humbling. Yet Theodore, staring at his silver map, realized something extraordinary. The empire, financially gutted and geographically mutilated, was ironically harder to kill than it had ever been. "They cut off the leg, Photius," Theodore said, a strange, desperate glint in his eye. "But the core remains. We are small, yes, but we are also now entirely dedicated to defense. Every man has a stake. Every field is a fortress." Photius, ever the pragmatist, merely shrugged. "And we still have not figured out where to get the good quality purple dye, my lord. The silks of the Empress are looking dreadfully pale." This was the Byzantine conundrum in a nutshell. The world had ended. The civilization had collapsed into a militarized zone of constant warfare. And yet, the ancient, glorious preoccupation with status and proper imperial color continued, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the new era of iron and starvation. The Romans had been forced onto a strict diet of necessity, and it was turning them into something entirely new, a tightly wound, resilient, and utterly ruthless fighting machine, prepared to endure centuries of siege warfare simply because they had nowhere left to run. They had been pruned down to the bone, and sometimes historical observation tells us pruning is exactly what an overgrown, complacent organism needs to survive the coming winter. The old world was dead. Long live the desperately pragmatic, newly forged military state of the Byzantine Empire. They had lost the gold, but they had found the grit. The year was somewhere in the murky, terrifying landscape of the early 7th century, a period history professors tend to skim over lightly, mostly because documenting the utter financial ruin and systematic governmental collapse of the formerly glorious Roman world is truly depressing work. But for the men and women locked behind the triple-ringed fortifications of Constantinople, this was not history. This was Tuesday, and Tuesday meant another painful administrative meeting where they decided which piece of venerable tradition they absolutely had to shred just to survive until Wednesday. Theodore, the man with the desperate glint and the silver map, was now perpetually stained with ink and worry lines. He sat in a small windowless chamber in the imperial palace, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and the faint metallic scent of melting gold coins. The latter being a sound that should have been glorious, but now sounded suspiciously like a civilization coughing up its own vital organs. Across the table sat Photius, still fussing over the quality of purple dye, but now also tasked with implementing the most radical and humiliating structural changes the imperial administration had ever faced. "My lord," Photius sighed, adjusting a perfectly starched linen cuff. "We have established that the gold reserve, though technically still existent, is perhaps sufficient to pay for precisely 4 months of the remaining standing army, provided they agree to accept rations consisting primarily of dried lentils and the occasional deeply suspicious dried fish." Theodore tapped the map, his gaze resting on the now irrelevant former provinces of Africa and Italy, places that might as well have been on the moon. 4 months is 3 months and 30 days longer than our current strategic outlook, Photius. We must stop pretending this is a temporary recession requiring mild austerity. This is a permanent, existential shift. The bureaucracy must acknowledge that the empire is no longer running a tax-collecting organization. We are running a heavily armed, semi-religious refugee camp. This was the ideological foundation being poured into the cracked cement of the old world. The metamorphosis had begun. The Romans had once believed they were the divinely mandated universal empire, rulers of all known lands, simply because they were the Romans. Now, that was utter nonsense. The land was gone, the gold was gone, and the universal claim was being mocked weekly by aggressively mounted cavalry hordes from every direction. They had nowhere to go but inward, spiritually and physically. The empire thus recast itself quite brilliantly, not as the ruler of the world, but as the chosen people of God, besieged by the unholy forces of darkness. Their new mission was not expansion, but dogged, bloody, righteous survival. Constantinople was no longer the political hub. It was the Christian fortress, the Ark of Civilization, holding out until the apocalypse decided to wrap things up. This shift was immensely helpful, primarily because it allowed the administrators to dress up necessary, unpleasant budget cuts as acts of profound piety. Why did they abandon the frivolous games and extravagant processions? Because they were spiritually lean, focused on the true prize. Why did the legions have to suddenly pay for their own equipment? Because God loves a man who can show initiative. The psychological pressure cooker had forged a new identity, one that was paranoid, highly religious, and fiercely, militantly defensive. They were the remnant, and they knew it. "The populace is restless, my lord," Photius murmured, bringing the conversation back to the unpleasant reality of governance. They understand the shift in liturgy, they appreciate the extra incense, but they fundamentally object to the lack of bread and the increased demand for conscription. The old system, the one where the state paid salaries and provided lavish games, is lodged deeply in the public memory. The old system, Theodore countered, leaning forward until his knuckles were white against the worn table, was built upon the bedrock of Egyptian wheat shipments, North African tax revenue, and the occasional glorious loot from conquering some wealthy neighbor. All three are now unavailable. Therefore, the old system is not merely defunct, it is an economic phantom that will murder us if we continue to chase it. The central problem was simple. Defense was locally necessary, but the ability to pay for it was centrally bankrupt. A soldier on the distant border needed to be paid now to hold the line, not wait 9 months for a heavily guarded and often intercepted shipment of coins to leave Constantinople. The solution, cooked up in the frantic minds of Theodore and a handful of other desperate, sharp-witted bureaucrats, was revolutionary. It was brutal. It was the absolute, final, necessary divorce from 2,000 years of Roman military tradition. "We introduced the themata," Theodore announced, using the newly coined Greek term, the administrative name for the new reality, the theme system. Photius blinked, rubbing his temples. "Yes, themes. I still object to the name. It sounds dreadfully vague, almost theatrical. Does it refer to a division of troops, or perhaps a particularly boring administrative district?" "Both," Theodore said dryly. "And that, Photius, is the genius of it. No longer shall we have administrative provinces ruled by civilian governors, praetorian prefects, and military units, duces and comites, operating separately. That requires 2 sets of bureaucratic paper trails, 2 sets of salaries, and 2 layers of inefficiency. Under the theme system, the remaining territory was carved into massive, decentralized military administrative districts. Each thema was placed under the absolute command of a strategos, a general, a military man, who was now also the supreme judicial and civil authority within his territory. He held the power of the sword and the power of the ledger. The theoretical horror of this to any traditional Roman was immense. It was the official end of the separation of powers that Augustus had painstakingly established. It was decentralization to the point of potentially inviting civil war. It was messy, but it worked because it was rooted in the land itself. "We stopped paying salaries," Theodore continued, speaking slowly, measuring the effect of the words on Photius. "We do not have the gold. Instead, we pay with the only commodity we have left in relative abundance, confiscated, often poorly maintained, and severely undesirable agricultural land." This was the core of the Byzantine metamorphosis. The stratiotes, the soldiers, were no longer salaried professionals dependent on the central treasury. They were transformed into soldier farmers. Each man who served in the theme forces, cavalry, infantry, or auxiliary, was granted a plot of imperial land known as a kleros, or sometimes pronoia. This land was inalienable. He could not sell it. It belonged to his family, passed down through the generations, conditional only on one critical clause. The son, or a suitable replacement, must serve in the same military unit when the father died or retired. "The stratiotes is now paid by his own wheat crop," Theodore summarized. "He is self-sustaining. He maintains his own horse, buys his own armor, and provides his own rations for campaign. The central state is relieved of the crippling financial burden of millions of individual salaries, supply lines that are constantly being raided, and the general administrative chaos that accompanies fielding a massive professional army." Photius chewed thoughtfully on his lower lip. So instead of a vast, expensive professional force that requires 10,000 clerks to manage its payroll, we have thousands upon thousands of highly motivated, highly decentralized local militias whose payment is intrinsically tied to the defense of their own hearth and home. Precisely, Theodore confirmed, nodding sharply. Why fight for the abstract glory of an emperor hundreds of miles away when you can fight for the field where your children planted their millet? The psychology is immediate, primal, and incredibly resilient. The introduction of the themes did not happen cleanly. It was a chaotic, decades-long process that required the seizure of vast aristocratic estates, the breaking of the power of the great land-owning families, who, conveniently, had often proved unwilling to pay taxes anyway, and the forced resettlement of military units into new territories. It was class warfare disguised as military reform. The benefits were almost instantaneous and incredibly profound. First, the army suddenly became deeply rooted and local. When the enemy attacked, the defenders weren't a detachment of hired mercenaries passing through. They were the local neighbors, fighting for the very soil they tilled. The morale gain was incalculable. Second, the system, though designed for war, was economically self-stabilizing. The theme soldiers were productive citizens during peacetime, ensuring that the critical agrarian base was maintained. They were not a drain on the economy. They were the economy, farming their land for 7 months of the year and training for the remaining 5. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the survival of the state, the themes were cheap. In an era where Constantinople's treasury was dealing with yearly deficits in the hundreds of thousands of solidi, shifting the military payroll onto agrarian assets saved the empire from immediate collapse. And the strategos, Photius noted, his eyes narrowing. The new supreme commander of the theme. He now commands an army of perhaps 10,000 men, levies all local taxes, administers all justice, and is essentially a king in his own mountainous territory. What ensures his loyalty, my lord? The old system kept civilian and military power separate specifically to prevent such potentates from challenging the throne. Theodore permitted himself a small, weary smile, acknowledging the uncomfortable truth. The short answer, Photius, is that nothing ensures his loyalty except the immediacy of the threat. We rely on the fact that he is currently too busy fighting the Saracens, the Slavs, and the Bulgars to fight us. And if he tries, we rely on the fact that the other 6 or 7 strategos will collectively remind him that challenging the emperor is poor career planning. The empire had been forced to gamble. It had traded administrative purity for tactical necessity. It accepted the inherent danger of powerful, decentralized military governors because the alternative was immediate annihilation. The administrative landscape of the former Roman Empire was now divided into these massive, self-contained military fortresses. The thema of Anatolikon, the Eastern theme, became the largest, the anvil upon which the empire's survival was hammered out. The thema of Armeniakon and the Opsikion followed, each a heavily armed semi-autonomous statelet that provided instant defense against the implacable siege that lasted for centuries. These reforms, the ideological transformation into the Christian fortress, the financial shift from gold payments to land grants, and the administrative centralization of military and civilian power under the strategos were not acts of genius policy planning. They were acts of desperate, pragmatic improvisation under intense, continuous pressure. They were the equivalent of a man whose house is burning down, using the furniture to shore up the foundation instead of trying to save the antique silver. And it worked. By the time the initial chaotic implementation of the theme system stabilized, a process that took nearly 70 years and involved numerous minor rebellions and vast amounts of spilled ink, The Byzantine Empire had completed its metamorphosis. It was no longer the bloated, philosophical ghost of the old Roman world. It was lean, mean, militarized, and deeply entrenched in the Anatolian heartland. The empire had lost 90% of its historical territory, but the remaining 10% was now organized into a defensive grid of self-sustaining, deeply motivated Christian warrior farmers. They had shed the illusion of universal rule for the gritty reality of localized defense. "The financial reports, Photius," Theodore commanded, pulling a small, tightly rolled scroll toward him. "How much silver are we committing to the immediate defense of the Thracian wall?" "We commit 100,000 solidice in liquid funds, my lord, to reinforce the garrisons, but we estimate the total defense expenditure is equivalent to a further 600,000 solidice per annum, which is now carried entirely by the theme soldiers themselves through their land grants and mandatory equipment contributions." Theodore looked at the massive difference in those two numbers, the paltry gold-based imperial contribution versus the massive land-based contribution from the newly reformed military class. It was the proof. The empire was no longer paying for its own defense. It had found a way for the land itself to pay for its preservation. "The old world died for the lack of 700,000 solidi," Theodore whispered, staring at the ceiling of the ancient palace, now smelling faintly of gunpowder and fear. "And the new world lives because we finally figured out how to convince the wheat fields to pay the taxes. It was ugly, it was demanding, and it certainly wasn't the glorious Rome of the history books. But it had grit. And as history will attest, sometimes grit, when properly organized and backed by a deep defensive ideology, is far more useful than all the gold in the world. The military machine of the Byzantine Empire had been forged not in victory, but in continuous, necessary retreat. The Age of Iron had begun, and the new Roman state, stripped to the bone, was finally, painfully ready to endure it. They had bought themselves centuries of survival with a single, sweeping, desperate administrative decree. The transformation of the empire, as Theodore the Strategos had glumly noted, hinged entirely on the fact that they had taught the wheat fields to pay the taxes. But grain, while immensely useful for preventing immediate starvation or widespread peasant revolt, two things the Byzantines considered equally tedious, did not stop a determined army of invaders armed with massive battering rams and an unfortunate amount of patience. The theme system provided the grit and the manpower. The soldiers of Anatolia provided the necessary hatred and religious zealotry to keep fighting. But true, sustained survival required something less emotional and much more concrete. It required geometry. It required metallurgy. It required, in short, a collective, obsessive commitment to engineering that bordered on architectural paranoia. This was the Age of Iron, and nowhere was that metal more beautifully, stubbornly, and expensively deployed than in the defensive mechanism of the new Rome. For centuries, Constantinople was not merely a city, it was the world's most successful piece of architectural arrogance. It was a massive, shimmering gold lockbox, built explicitly to annoy anyone who dared to knock. If the internal reorganization of the Byzantine state was driven by the necessity of retreat, then the engineering program was driven by the terrifying memory of near collapse. The reforms were designed by survivors, and survivors, as a rule, tend to overcompensate. They don't build houses, they build fortifications. Meet Strategos Aetius, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair and whose strategic genius was matched only by his profound suspicion of everyone outside his immediate vicinity. He stood atop the inner circuit of the Theodosian walls, squinting westward. The mid-morning sun caught the dust motes dancing over the great sloping brickwork, that had defied every siege engine invented by mankind for more than 300 years. 300 years, Aetius muttered, running a hand over the rough stone of the parapet. And yet, if even one of those cursed Saracens managed to drag a ram up this far, all the glorious geometry would turn to dust in an afternoon. Beside him stood Photius, the chief logistical officer, a man whose mind was a terrifyingly efficient calculator wrapped in a silk robe. Photius was currently tallying the inventory of arrowheads in the Cistern district, a task that required the focused serenity of a monk and the mathematical ruthlessness of a tax collector. "My lord Strategos, the geometry is precisely why they have not passed," Photius corrected mildly, adjusting his spectacles. "The walls are an expression of systemic resilience, not merely brute force. We did not build a single wall. We built a defense complex designed to frustrate the concept of momentum." He pointed down. Below them lay the notorious moat, a ridiculously wide 20-foot deep trench that could be flooded in moments. Beyond the moat stood the outer circuit, a wall of roughly 30 feet high, punctuated by low-slung towers that made crossfire mathematically inevitable for any advancing enemy. And beyond that, the real monstrosity, was the great inner curtain, rising to nearly 60 feet, capped by towers that provided overlapping fields of fire stretching for miles. It was, Photius often mused privately, the world's largest and most complicated security alarm system. "We commit £100,000 of lead per decade to the upkeep of the Third Circuit towers alone," Photius continued, the sheer weight of the number rolling off his tongue without inflection. "The cost in the long term is astronomical, but the cost of the walls failing, my lord, is geometrically infinite. The genius of the Theodosian walls was that they were never intended to be taken by storm. They were intended to absorb blows, force the enemy to burn time, money, and morale, and then, after 6 months of misery and dysentery, send them home to explain to their caliphs or khans why besieging Constantinople was fundamentally a very poor career choice. The walls embodied the new Byzantine philosophy. We do not need to defeat you in a fair fight. We merely need to survive you." This defensive engineering was not confined to stone and mortar. It permeated the entire logistical chain that supported the capital, ensuring that the inhabitants and the necessary soldiers could hold out for not just months, but years. The resilience of the city wasn't just its triple layers of defense. It was the incredible subterranean network of cisterns, massive, cathedral-like vaults holding millions of gallons of fresh water, and the massive, government-controlled granaries that ensured that famine, the siege weapon more effective than any ram, was kept perpetually outside the Golden Gate. Logistics, it turned out, was the single greatest innovation of the Byzantine military machine. The emperor, whoever he happened to be at any given moment, and the history of this period suggests that the job often involved an unusually high turnover rate, understood perfectly well that the walls only protected one extremely important flank. The sea, the deep blue highway that connected the Mediterranean world, was both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity. If the land defenses were a testament to stone and stubbornness, the sea defense was a testament to speed and chemistry. The strategos Aetius, having satisfied his daily quota of anxiety concerning the western landward defenses, moved now to the naval arsenal docked in the Golden Horn. The smell of pitch, salt, and human sweat hung heavy in the air. "The fleet is not ready, Commander Basil," Aetius declared, without asking a question. "The inspection reports indicate that 36 of the new dromons are delayed due to a shortage of seasoned cedar." Commander Basil, a man whose face was perpetually wind-burned and whose respect for imperial bureaucracy was minimal, merely grunted. "My lord Strategos, the fleet is ready enough," Basil replied, chewing on a piece of dried meat. "And we are not building triremes designed for glory, but dromons designed for speed. We have abandoned the philosophical idea of naval dominance for the pragmatic reality of maritime interception." The Byzantine navy, or what was left of it, was radically different from the vast, slow, heavily manned fleets of previous eras. It had been winnowed down to a core of fast, sleek war galleys known as dromons. These were the greyhounds of the sea, lightly constructed, highly maneuverable, and specialized for fast attacks, rapid retreats, and crucially, the deployment of the secret weapon. The fleet's primary objective was not to destroy enemy navies wholesale in open-sea spectaculars. That was far too expensive and high risk for the lean new military budget. Its goal was to secure the supply lines connecting Constantinople to the wealthy agricultural themes in Anatolia and the vital island garrisons, and most importantly, to guard the sea approaches to the capital itself. The entire Aegean Sea was managed as a colossal, floating defensive corridor. The logistical challenge was nightmarish. Every island garrison, every strategically placed lighthouse, every isolated coastal fort required a ceaseless, meticulous flow of provisions: olive oil, salted pork, wine, and replacement personnel. "The theme of the Aegean," Photius murmured, consulting his scrolls, "requires 2,780 separate shipments annually, ranging from replacement rope for the smaller vessels to grain sufficient for 4,000 mouths across the island chain." This logistical dance required more strategic genius than winning a battle. It meant coordinating the harvests of the eastern themes with the shipping capacity of the centralized naval docks, all while dodging the perpetually aggressive fleets of the Caliphate and the troublesome piracy of the southern coasts. The urban resilience of Constantinople was entirely dependent on this constant, invisible stream of trade and supply. If the sea lanes failed, the walls were merely a very elaborate coffin. The empire, having shifted the cost of land defense onto its soldiers, now relied on the tightest centralization of naval power and logistics the world had ever seen, ensuring that the heart of the machine kept pumping despite the arterial pressure. But the true genius, the final shimmering layer of defense that guaranteed the survival of the empire when all else failed, was a weapon that defied water, logic, and common sense. It was the engineering secret that was guarded more jealously than the emperor's own bath schedule. It was, of course, Greek fire. Aetius and Basil approached a restricted pier where a lone dromon, designated the Scorpion, was moored. The air here was strangely quiet, tainted by a faint chemical smell, like sulfur and ancient oil gone very, very wrong. "I hate this substance," Aetius stated flatly. "It smells of the devil and bureaucracy." Basil chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "My lord, the enemies of the empire hate it even more, and that is its sole purpose." Greek fire was, quite simply, chemistry applied to psychological warfare. It was a substance projected through a bronze siphon, often mounted on the prow of the specialized dromons. When launched, it erupted into an adhesive, terrifying blaze that could not be extinguished by water. Indeed, pouring water on it often made it worse. The precise composition of this terrifying liquid was known only to a few trusted engineers, a small, dedicated cadre who were, shall we say, heavily discouraged from seeking employment elsewhere. Rumors abounded. It contained crude petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, resin, and even snake venom, depending on which frightened sailor you asked. Whatever the contents, the effect was devastating. Basil led Aetius to a testing area, a section of an old abandoned fishing vessel, bobbing sadly in the water. A technician, swathed in thick leather aprons and wearing the weary look of a man who constantly handled things that wanted to burn him, stood ready. "Demonstration, if you please, Technician 1," Basil instructed. The technician, whose name was probably Theodore, but who answered only to the prefix technician, aimed the small handheld siphon at the derelict boat. A heavy, hissing sound preceded the launch. The liquid, thick and slightly yellowish, struck the hull. The air immediately fractured with the sound of a vicious, spontaneous combustion. Not the slow, gentle burn of pitch, but an instant, furious eruption of flame. Phaetius instinctively shielded his face, though he was standing 20 yards away. The flames were bright orange, clinging viciously to the wet wood. When the technician tossed a bucket of water onto the blazing section, the flames did not shrink. They danced, spat, and spread further, riding the surface of the water as if it were pure oxygen. "See, my lord," Basil said, his voice quiet against the roar of the chemical fire. "The terror is the weapon. When a man sees his friend's ship burning with a fire that water cannot defeat, he does not ask questions about the composition of the naphtha. He asks how quickly he can sail away from the entire situation." Greek fire fundamentally changed naval warfare in the Mediterranean. It took the psychological edge away from the larger, often more numerous fleets of the invaders. A battle ceased to be a collision of ships. It became a terrifying lottery, where one unlucky hit meant the difference between a skirmish and a roaring, inescapable immolation. This weapon, paired with the speed of the dromons, allowed the Byzantine fleet to punch far above its weight. They didn't need to sink every ship. They just needed to create enough panic, enough chemical havoc to enforce the imperial maritime lockdown. The success of the Byzantine Empire in this new Iron Age, an era where survival was measured in decades, not centuries, was fundamentally based on this triangular approach to defense. 1. The land. The Theodosian Walls, a monumental statement of defiance. A defense system designed to grind time into dust and consume the morale of the besieger. The walls demanded an absurd amount of time and effort from the enemy, serving as an insurmountable psychological hurdle. 2. The sea. The fast, specialized fleet of dromons, backed by the most complex centralized logistics network in the world. The fleet ensured the urban heart of the empire could breathe, feed itself, and endure. Urban resilience, in this case, meant that every barrel of salted fish was accounted for and delivered on time. 3. The innovation. Greek fire, the ultimate, terrifying "do not enter" sign. This chemical innovation tipped the naval balance, proving that military power wasn't always about who had the most troops, but who had the nastiest surprise. The Age of Iron, the age of necessary retreat, had forced the Byzantines to realize that the grand, sweeping philosophical campaigns of old were a luxury they could no longer afford. They had to get tactical, they had to get technical, and they had to embrace the fact that defensive warfare was, in its own way, the highest form of strategic cunning. The empire did not invest in glory. It invested in survival. It built the triple wall, it perfected the supply chain, and it invented liquid fire that laughed at water. It had, in essence, perfected the science of endurance. "The world believes we survive through divine grace," Aetius said finally, staring out across the sun-drenched, heavily armed Golden Horn. Photius smiled faintly, adjusting his scrolls that detailed the annual procurement schedule for copper for the siphons. "Divine grace helps, my lord, but I assure you it is the 700,000 solidi worth of logistics and the 5,000 tons of strategically placed rock that truly carry the load." The Age of Iron was deeply pragmatic, thoroughly demanding, and certainly lacked the poetic flourish of the old Roman legions. But as history would attest, The Byzantines understood a simple truth that their enemies often forgot. It's hard to conquer a civilization when you can't even get past the front door, especially when the welcome mat is on fire and the door itself is 60 feet tall. They had bought themselves, through ingenuity and sheer stubborn engineering, many more centuries of precarious, heavily fortified existence. The Byzantine Empire, that grand, cynical institution of mosaics and impenetrable bureaucracy, was not often given to poetry. It survived not on sweeping philosophical pronouncements, but on spreadsheets, meticulously maintained walls, and most critically, on the horrifying, sticky mystery known only as Greek fire. It was perhaps the greatest running joke of the early medieval world. You could conquer half a continent with steel and fervor, but when you reached the harbor of Constantinople, the universe seemed to develop a nasty chemical cough. The men who operated the siphonatores, the specialized siege engines and ship-mounted flamethrowers, were not treated as common soldiers. They were the priests of a fiery new faith, administering a sacrament of destruction that defied the known laws of nature. And their liturgy. It was simple. This fire will not go out, and we will not tell you why. We must understand that for the burgeoning Islamic caliphates, the 7th and 8th centuries were a period of breathtaking, almost unstoppable expansion. They were driven by faith, disciplined by necessity, and accustomed to the sweet taste of victory against demoralized, decaying opponents. They swept across the sands and seas with a ferocity that rewrote the maps of the known world. They devoured the provinces of Persia, humbled the Visigoths in Hispania, and generally made life very uncomfortable for anyone who still claimed the old Roman lineage. But then they met the Queen of Cities, Constantinople, the eye of the known world, guarded not just by stone, but by an absolute refusal to play fair. The naval encounters, particularly the great sieges of the early 8th century, stand as the historical fulcrum where sheer zeal met the cold, hard reality of specialized chemistry. The Umayyad fleet, a massive armada intended to starve and shatter the city, arrived with confidence born of previous successes. Hundreds of ships, countless men, and the certainty that destiny was on their side. What they encountered was not a conventional defense. It was chemical warfare elevated to an art form, a terrifying form of maritime asymmetrical combat. Imagine, if you will, the scene. The sun glints off the water of the Marmara Sea. The two massive fleets draw near, the air thick with the smell of brine, sweat, and anticipation. The Arab commanders, observing the smaller, faster Byzantine dromons, anticipate a conventional engagement, grappling hooks, boarding parties, arrows, and perhaps the dull, satisfying sound of a hull cracking under a ram. Then the dromons turn slightly, revealing the bronze beast mounted on their bow, the siphon. And then hell arrived, not in a great rolling wave, but in a pressurized, sticky stream. "It looks like oil, but wetter," murmured Commander Hisham, watching from the deck of his flagship, a vessel he had proudly christened the Swift Destroyer. He squinted, trying to discern the strange substance coating the nearest Byzantine ship. "Wait, they're firing water." His second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Tariq, who had seen too many sieges to ever be surprised again, a certainty he was about to lose, shook his head slowly. "No, my lord. Look at the color. It's too pale. And it smells sharp, like the brass polisher, but fermented." Before Hisham could offer a witty reply about Byzantine hygiene, a sharp, terrible roar erupted from the dromons. A terrifying sound of pressurized air meeting something combustible, and then the stream of pale liquid that was too wet to be oil struck one of the Umayyad skirmishers. The resulting explosion was less a traditional burst of flame and more the sudden, catastrophic blooming of an unnatural inferno. It was fire that seemed to consume the air itself, green and yellow, clinging aggressively to the waterlogged wood, as if the sea was only there to infuriate it further. "It is not fire," Tariq shouted, his voice cracking as the unfortunate skirmisher ship, now a screaming funeral pyre, began to list heavily. "It is molten horror. Look, they are throwing sand on it and it only burns brighter." This was the pivotal moment, repeated thousands upon thousands of times in the naval history of that century. The moment when the expansionist impulse of a dynamic, powerful civilization met a technical hurdle so insurmountable that it literally stopped them dead in the water. Greek fire, or pir thalassion, sea fire, as the Byzantines so dryly termed it, was the ultimate psychological weapon. It wasn't just the impossible nature of the substance, a liquid that water actively fueled, fire that had to be smothered with vinegar, sand, or, in the absolute worst case, expensive urine. It was the mystery. The caliphates could field more men, more ships, and often better generals, but they could not replicate the fire. And if you cannot board the enemy, and you cannot sink the enemy, and you cannot even put out the flame they squirt at you from a glorified brass hose, the math of conquest suddenly becomes far less appealing. The sieges failed spectacularly and repeatedly. The massive Arab fleets which had so effortlessly dominated the Mediterranean were not sunk by superior tactics, but melted by superior chemistry. The strategic result was profound. The maritime flank of Constantinople was secured. The city could breathe. Its supply lines remained open, and the massive logistical burden of keeping hundreds of thousands of people fed behind the Theodosian walls could continue unabated. The Byzantine Empire had not simply won a battle, it had redefined the terms of engagement for an entire age. This brings us to the second and arguably more fascinating aspect of Greek fire: how a single, proprietary piece of technology became the foundational pillar of an entire civilization's self-concept and policy. The survival of the Byzantine Empire, its longevity, which stretched for well over a millennium after the collapse of the West, was not a function of divine favor, but of a very earthly, highly pragmatic decision to invest heavily in scientific and technical defense. They realized long before anyone else that in a period of retreat, innovation was the only currency that truly mattered. Greek fire was not just a weapon, it was an entire industry, a state secret managed with obsessive, terrifying zeal. In Constantinople, there were entire bureaus dedicated solely to the procurement of its ingredients, whatever they may have been, we still don't know, which is the finest testament to Byzantine secrecy, and the maintenance of the highly specialized equipment. This was top-tier logistics, not for soldiers or gold, but for the components of liquid hell. Imagine the atmosphere in the imperial workshops. These were not smoky forges. These were laboratories, guarded by 5 times the number of men guarding the imperial treasury. The artisans, engineers, and scientists were the most important non-military functionaries in the empire. They were privy to the greatest state secret, and thus were subjected to the greatest scrutiny. Photius, the same logistikos who meticulously tracked salted fish and copper siphons, viewed the maintenance of the Greek fire production lines as his holiest duty. He was having a discussion, a rather tense one, as most discussions about existential threats tend to be, with Strategos Basilius in the echoing stone hallway beneath the Augusteum. The supply of refined naphtha this year is 3,827 litres short of the projection, Photius declared, running a pale, anxious finger down a column of script on his scroll. If we face another deployment requirement, similar to the one we suffered near Rhodes 2 years ago, we will be forced to ration the mixture by approximately 712 combat engagements. Basilius, a man whose face was etched with the strain of watching ships burn, sighed heavily. Photius, are you telling me that the fate of the entire known world hinges upon the timely delivery of 3,000 units of foul-smelling goo? Precisely, Strategos, Photius replied, adjusting his spectacles. It hinges upon the controlled, timely delivery of the foul-smelling goo. The glory of Rome, such as it is now, is based entirely on our ability to squirt flammable material farther and more efficiently than our enemies can process the trauma. This interaction encapsulates the essence of the Byzantine state in the Age of Iron. They didn't talk about conquering Italy, they talked about cubic metrics of sticky, incendiary fluid. For the Byzantines, technology was not merely a tool of war, it was the mechanism of cultural continuity. The preservation of the state was the preservation of the technological secret. If the formula for Greek fire fell into enemy hands, the walls of Constantinople might as well have been made of damp cheesecloth. The technology, therefore, necessitated a level of centralized control, secrecy, and scientific patronage that was unique in that era. The empire became, in essence, a high-tech fortress state. The massive resources devoted to the development and maintenance of this one weapon meant that the state apparatus was continually required to fund, educate, and protect its most technically proficient citizens. This investment created a positive feedback loop. The need for advanced military defense necessitated advanced civilian infrastructure and scientific literacy, which in turn allowed them to better defend the secret. They had, quite brilliantly, turned a military deterrent into a driver of civilizational stability. The secrecy surrounding Greek fire was legendary, absolute, and ruthlessly enforced. The formula was considered a divine gift, revealed directly to the emperor, ensuring that its knowledge remained a closely guarded state monopoly, passing only between designated, trusted officials. To reveal the secret was not treason, it was sacrilege. And this secrecy created something even more powerful than the weapon itself, the myth. When the Arab sailors spoke of the pirao that laughed at water, they weren't just describing a weapon, they were describing Byzantine magic. The unknown component of the formula, the secret ingredient, became a psychological horror. The enemies didn't just fear the fire, they feared what else the Byzantines knew how to invent. This technological superiority created an invisible boundary line, a psychological deterrent that stretched far beyond the effective range of the siphon. It enforced peace through perceived capability. Why launch a naval invasion when the mere rumor of Greek fire could send your sailors into a panic? The interruption of the Islamic expansion, particularly in the Mediterranean, was not due to a single miraculous battle, but the grinding, demoralizing reality of facing an enemy who could spontaneously ignite your warship and then smirk about it. The momentum that had carried the caliphates from the Arabian Peninsula to the shores of Gaul stuttered, stalled, and eventually redirected itself elsewhere, leaving the Eastern Roman Empire, battered but whole, still standing on its strategic rock. Aetius, now older and slightly grayer, watched a fresh, newly constructed dromon undergoing sea trials in the Golden Horn. The bronze siphon was polished to a terrifying gleam. We survive by refusing to participate in the ancient rules of war, he mused to Basilius, who had since traded the strategos title for a quieter administrative post, now overseeing the annual testing of the new siphon valves. Indeed, my lord, Basilius responded, leaning against the cold stone railing. Our enemies believe that honor is found in the clash of swords and the courage of men, We know that survival is found in complex chemical reactions and 3-inch brass fittings. He paused, then added, with the slight cynical smile common to all high-ranking Byzantine officials, and the enduring mystery of the secret ingredient. That, Aetius, is worth more than 5,000 legions. The empire had secured its survival not through size or wealth, but through the careful cultivation of one singular, horrifying, and absolutely indispensable technological advantage. It was an imperial power built on the terrifying, sticky reality that the Byzantines had found a way to weaponize chemistry and myth in equal measure. They understood that the most successful defensive strategy is the one that convinces the attacker that the cost of entry is simply too high, especially when the welcome mat burns hotter than the sun and cannot be extinguished. And so the vast, complex machine of the empire continued to grind on, its 1,000-year endurance fueled by the most revolutionary, destructive, and wonderfully secret formula the medieval world had ever conceived. It was a civilization sustained, quite literally, by a flame that refused to die. The problem with creating a devastating, mythologically charged weapon is that eventually someone has to test it. You can spread all the terrifying, sticky rumors you like, but when your empire is built on relentless expansion, eventually the leadership decides that the potential riches of the Byzantine capital are worth the risk of being spontaneously combusted. This realization led to 2 colossal, earth-shaking, and ultimately disastrous undertakings by the rising Umayyad Caliphate, the great sieges of Constantinople. These were not mere skirmishes. They were declarations of intent, existential threats launched with the logistical arrogance of men who believed destiny was firmly stapled to their banner. The first wave, commencing around the mid-600s, was less a siege and more a prolonged, aggressive misunderstanding of maritime warfare. The Umayyad forces, fresh from conquering vast swathes of North Africa and the Levant, brought a fleet of immense size, filled with men who had seen every defense buckle and every ruler flee. They arrived at the massive, triple-layered Theodosian walls by land and brought their considerable navy to the heavily fortified sea walls, prepared for what they assumed would be a swift, glorious, and highly profitable affair. What followed was one of history's most profound examples of no thank you. Constantinople was not just a city. It was an 18-mile impregnable oyster made of granite, logistics, and stubborn, mule-headed Roman refusal to surrender. The Arab strategy, to blockade the capital and starve it into submission, was sound theoretically. The tactical flaw lay in the Byzantines' access to the Black Sea, usually. More critically, the psychological flaw lay in the invaders' profound lack of preparation for the PII. Imagine, if you will, the typical siege experience for a 7th century Arab sailor. You maneuver your warship, you exchange arrows, perhaps you attempt to use grappling hooks, and then you anticipate a glorious close-quarters boarding action. It is hard, dirty work, but predictable. Now imagine the Byzantine dromon, gliding like a predatory swan out of the Golden Horn, its bow fitted with that terrifying brass instrument, the siphon, that looked less like a weapon and more like the enraged snout of a metallic dragon. The resulting scene was historical pandemonium. Basilius, now an octogenarian bureaucrat whose administrative job was chiefly ensuring that the PIR formula remained under lock, and 2,500 keys received the reports with grim satisfaction. They did not anticipate the sound of it, did they? Basilius mused to his subordinate, a young, nervous strategos named Theophanes, during the spring of the siege's 2nd year. Theophanes, who had actually been on the walls, shuddered. My lord, they certainly did not. It is not the roar of a catapult. It is a wet, furious hiss. followed by the terrifying sight of a liquid that adheres to wood like a hungry lamprey and then erupts into a scorching, unquenchable inferno. The genius of the pyre, as Aetius had foreseen, was that it destroyed not just ships but morale. The Umayyad strategy of maintaining a continuous blockade failed almost immediately. The first few naval engagements were instructional, a catastrophic lesson in chemistry. The Arab fleet could not anchor safely near the walls, and every attempt to force the boom across the Golden Horn resulted in targeted explosive incineration. The Byzantines, in a masterstroke of psychological warfare, did not unleash the fire constantly. They used it sparingly, precisely, and with theatrical timing, ensuring that the sight of a burning, screaming ship became synonymous with a clash against the Byzantine navy. It was the maritime equivalent of a sniper. You didn't know where the next shot would come from, only that it would be lethal. The siege dragged on for nearly 7 years, a testament to Umayyad's stubbornness and logistical genius, but also a testament to their incredible hubris. They established vast, complex winter camps on the nearby Anatolian coast, attempting to turn the blockade into a seasonal tradition. For the citizens of Constantinople, the siege settled into a weary routine. They dealt with shortages, certainly, but never starvation. They listened to the distant din of battle, the shouts, and then, inevitably, the horrific, sizzling screams that accompanied the deployment of the secret weapon. By the time the remaining caliphal forces finally packed up their tents and sailed home in shame, they left behind not only scorched earth and immense casualties, but a far more lasting legacy: the confirmation that the Eastern Roman Empire possessed a defensive capability fundamentally different and terrifyingly superior to anything known in the civilized world. The Byzantines had won the war not through overwhelming numbers or martial superiority, but by making the attempt mathematically, psychologically, and chemically impossible. Following the ignominious end of the First Great Siege, there was a period of fragile, uneasy peace, marked by intense strategic reassessment in the caliphate. The defeat was an expensive, embarrassing setback, forcing the Umayyads to momentarily halt their westward advance and dedicate 5 years to rigorous naval training, shipbuilding, and, most importantly, logistics. They understood now that Constantinople would not fall quickly. It was a foe of inhuman endurance, and any subsequent attack required absolute commitment, iron discipline, and enough supplies to feed an army for a decade. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the mood was one of tired triumphalism, laced with that distinct Byzantine paranoia. They knew the enemy would return, but precisely when and how was the source of constant bureaucratic maneuvering and imperial dread. The empire, weakened by the long siege, suffered internal strife. Emperors rose and fell with unnerving rapidity, usually dispatched by ambitious palace officials who viewed the imperial purple as a temporary uniform. The state machine, while immensely resilient, desperately needed a steady, cold hand on the rudder. That hand arrived in the person of Leo the Isaurian. Leo was not born to the purple. He was a strategos who ascended through sheer competence and military effectiveness rather than noble birth or courtly intrigue. He was practical, ruthless, and possessed a clear-eyed understanding of the existential threat posed by the returning caliphate. He took the throne in 717, precisely the moment the Umayyad war machine was ready to rumble again. The caliphate had learned its lessons brutally well. This was no mere blockade. This was an extinction-level event aimed squarely at the capital. The arrival of the second Umayyad siege force was a spectacle of overwhelming scale, designed to crush the city under sheer weight. Chroniclers, never shy about hyperbole but in this case perhaps accurate, spoke of 180,000 men marching across the Anatolian plains, and a fleet of 1,200 warships darkening the Marmara Sea. 180,000 soldiers, 1,200 ships. These numbers represented the accumulated effort and wealth of an entire expansive empire, all converging on a single strategically located city. The strategic intent was terrifyingly simple: complete, total annihilation of the city's ability to sustain itself. The Caliphate commander, Maslama, was no fool. He immediately recognized that the pier made naval assaults against the walls suicidal. Therefore, the ships were not primarily intended as assault vessels. They were floating iron bars meant to seal the city off from any external supply, creating a perfectly airtight naval blockade. On land, the 180,000 soldiers established a siege line so vast and complex that it stretched from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, completely enveloping the Theodosian walls. Maslama ordered the construction of a second, enormous siege wall behind his own lines, ensuring that any relief force from the Balkans would be trapped between two massive fortifications. This was patience and planning on a truly Roman scale. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Leo III, met this overwhelming force with a grim determination. Leo was not a flamboyant commander. He was a meticulous defensive coordinator. He knew the walls were the city's lifeblood, and he knew the pier was the fleet's last stand. They rely on mathematics, Leo is reported to have observed, watching the enemy engineers meticulously measure out their siege lines. They calculate based on the weight of men and the volume of supplies. We strategos rely on chemistry, morale, and the arrogance of winter. The first phase of the siege was a grueling slugfest. Catapults battered the triple walls, but the walls held, absorbing the punishment with the cold confidence of granite. The Arab siege engineers were competent, but the defenses, refined over 4 centuries, were simply too sophisticated. The key to the Byzantine defense lay, once again, at sea. The Caliphate fleet managed to deploy a heavy chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, successfully dividing the city's northern access. This was a critical victory for Maslama. However, the moment any Umayyad ship sailed too close to the chain's anchor points, or attempted to press the advantage against the lighter Byzantine vessels inside the Horn, Leo unleashed his chemical secret weapon. The sight was horrific. The massive, beautiful Arab dromons, laden with supplies and soldiers, would suddenly erupt into liquid fire, their crews abandoning ship in panicked, futile attempts to escape the sticky, flaming napalm. The Umayyad sailors, many of whom had heard the old whispered stories of the laughing fire, saw their worst nightmares manifested in burning tar and bronze tubing. The naval engagement was decided not by manpower, but by terrifying material science. The Umayyad fleet became less a siege weapon and more a permanent terrified guard detail, forced to maintain the blockade from a safe, cautious distance, lest they incur the Pirar's wrath. As the weeks bled into months, the sheer impossibility of breaching the walls or the naval defenses became a paralyzing reality for the besiegers. Then came the true, non-chemical ally of the Byzantines, the winter of 717, which was one of the coldest recorded in the region. The Umayyad army, built for the warm climates of the Levant, was unprepared for the relentless, biting cold. Logistical supply, already strained by the monumental size of the force, collapsed entirely under the deep snow and freezing temperatures. Inside the walls, the populace, though suffering, was supplied through the highly organized, albeit morally corrupt, Byzantine administrative system. They had planned for this. The state had stockpiled vast granaries. Outside the walls, the situation became apocalyptic. 180,000 men began to starve. The cold killed the weakest, and the desperation grew so profound that Maslama's soldiers reportedly began consuming their own horses, donkeys, and even boiled leather to survive. Leo III, watching the suffering from the ramparts, understood that the most potent defense was not active combat, but passive endurance. He needed only to wait for the enemy's meticulously planned logistics to turn against them. The siege lines, once models of disciplined engineering, dissolved into a sprawling, frozen camp of misery. Disease spread like wildfire through the weakened, freezing troops. When spring finally arrived, it brought not renewed hope for the Arabs, but utter despair. Maslama received news that an attempt by the Umayyad treasury to dispatch a second resupply fleet had been utterly destroyed by the pier upon arrival, sinking in flaming ruins into the Marmara. The Byzantines, with their secret weapon, had completely mastered their own coastal waters. The total failure of the blockade, the catastrophic casualties inflicted by the elements, and the absolute demoralization caused by the unquenchable chemical fire led Maslama to the only rational conclusion: retreat. The withdrawal was less a strategic maneuver and more a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. The army, now reduced to a fraction of its former glory by disease, starvation, and the occasional strategic ambush by the Byzantines, began the long, humiliating march home. The fleet fared even worse, harassed continuously by the Dromans armed with their liquid terror, and then decimated by a final, fierce storm in the Aegean Sea. The mighty armada of 1,200 ships was reduced to a miserable handful of 22 surviving vessels that limped back to Syrian ports. Constantinople had endured. The great sieges established two crucial facts in the global military mind. First, the Theodosian walls were, for all intents and purposes, physically unbreakable, and second, the Byzantines possessed a terrifying, mysterious chemical edge that rendered naval superiority irrelevant. Survival was secured. The sheer, overwhelming logistical failure of the Caliphate proved that even the mightiest power of the age could not overcome a city built on rock, fire, and the persistent, cynical refusal of the Eastern Romans to participate in anything resembling a fair fight. The capital city, having tested the limits of both physical endurance and spiritual resolve, stood defiant, bathed in the lingering, caustic smoke of liquid fire, a monument to technology masquerading as divine favor. The humiliation arrived in Damascus not as a grand defeat, announced by the clang of captured trophies, but as a slow, agonizing trickle of bad news carried by utterly exhausted survivors. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, the proud commander who had confidently set off with an army estimated near 180,000 fighting men and an astronomical fleet of 1,200 vessels, returned with fewer soldiers than could fill a mid-sized mosque and a pitiful collection of 22 crippled ships. It was, by any measure, a logistical and military catastrophe of such staggering proportions that it threatened to snap the Umayyad state in half. The siege of Constantinople, intended to be the glorious capstone of a century of astonishing conquest, had instead become a cautionary tale whispered darkly in the taverns of Alexandria and the marketplaces of Kufa. The capital city of the Romans, that stubborn, difficult, and technologically devious beast, had refused to simply roll over. The failure was not merely one of strategy, it was a failure of the Umayyad worldview. For decades, speed, fervor, and the sheer momentum of belief had carried the armies to victory after victory. But against the chilling realities of a Thracian winter, the indomitable height of the Theodosian walls, and the utterly terrifying, uncontrollable chaos of the Greek fire, fervor proved useless. Caliph Suleiman, who had banked his entire reign's prestige on this grand endeavor, had the great good fortune, or perhaps the ill fate, of dying shortly after the first reports of the devastating losses began arriving. This timely departure saved him the full reckoning, leaving the monumental headache to his successor. The new ruler was Omar ibn Abd al-Aziz, known to history rather uniquely for a medieval potentate, for his piety and his profound sense of administrative responsibility. If the first generation of caliphs had been warriors and conquerors, Omar II was something far less glamorous, but infinitely more necessary. He was a meticulous accountant disguised in the robes of a king. Omar II looked at the empire sprawling from the Indus River to the Atlantic coast and saw not a triumph, but a structural nightmare built entirely on credit and constant campaigning. The grand conquest machine had just hit a wall, literally a wall of rock and mortar, and had cracked. The consensus in the court suddenly pivoted from, how do we take Constantinople next, to the far more pressing question of, how do we afford the army we already have? This, my friends, is the moment when the Islamic world stopped being just an irresistible military tide and began the arduous, dusty, and infinitely dull process of becoming a superpower. They learned to love paperwork. Omar II realized that the true crisis facing the caliphate was not external, but internal. The core mechanism of the empire, the taxation system, was collapsing under the weight of its own success. Historically, the conquered peoples paid taxes, the jizya, poll tax, and the kharaj, land tax. Conversion to Islam brought spiritual salvation, but also tax exemption, which was naturally the greatest perk of all. As the early wave of conversions swelled, especially among the Mawali, non-Arab converts in Persia and Mesopotamia, the tax base shrank alarmingly. Why fund an empire if everyone was escaping the ledger? The treasury was hemorrhaging dinars, and the great campaign losses only accelerated the bleeding. Omar II's solution was less about grand theology and more about pragmatic, if utterly revolutionary, fiscal policy. He decreed, much to the horror of the entrenched Arab elite who enjoyed their tax-exempt status, that land taxes were now tied to the land, not the owner's religion. A Muslim could own the land, yes, but if it had previously been designated as tax-generating land, it would continue to generate tax. This was economic genius disguised as religious zeal. By stabilizing the revenue stream, Omar II effectively detached the state's finances from the immediate ebb and flow of religious conversion. He secured the financial bedrock of the sprawling domain. The empire could now afford its massive standing army, its dazzling court, and its ambitious irrigation projects, all while the bureaucracy for the first time began to function with the sort of precision usually reserved for Byzantine clockwork. This consolidation was not simply about collecting coin, it was about building a cohesive administrative identity. Omar II began standardizing weights, measures, and the legal framework across the vast distances. He insisted on Arabic as the singular language of administration, systematically replacing the Greek and Pahlavi scribes with freshly trained Arabic-speaking bureaucrats. He effectively told the people, "We failed at Constantinople, yes, but we are not going anywhere. We are here to stay, and we are going to organize your taxes, your roads, and your legal disputes with extreme efficiency." This shift, from constant outward-facing warfare to inward-facing meticulous state-building, was precisely what transformed the caliphate from a transient conquering force into a durable, multi-generational superpower. They were swapping the adrenaline rush of the jihad for the steady satisfaction of a balanced budget. However, even the most meticulous caliph could not entirely quiet the innate restlessness of the Arab military machine. The failure at the Golden Gate of Constantinople had demonstrated a hard limit in the West, but the military still demanded action, and the treasury still required new sources of wealth. The result was a highly strategic, two-pronged expansion into territories far from the Byzantine defensive web. If you couldn't beat the Romans at their capital, you could certainly outmaneuver them by swallowing up the rest of the known world. To the far west, the conquest of Al-Andalus. The Iberian Peninsula, which the Arabs would famously christen Al-Andalus, offered a glittering opportunity. Far from the naval strength and secret weapon of the Byzantines, the Visigothic kingdom was a fractured mess, riddled with internal religious and aristocratic squabbles. It was ripe for the picking, and the local population, oppressed by a corrupt elite, was often surprisingly indifferent to who ruled them, so long as the taxes weren't extortionate. The conquest had actually begun a few years earlier, around 711 AD, led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad and the Arab governor Musa ibn Nusayr. But the years immediately following the Constantinople debacle saw the true consolidation of this vast new territory. The strategy here was classic Umayyad brilliance, rapid military penetration, followed by remarkably tolerant governance. The conquest was so swift that by the time news reached Damascus, the armies were already establishing governance in places like Seville and Cordoba. Tariq and Musa, in a stunning display of administrative efficiency mixed with opportunism, simply pushed their armies north across the peninsula, turning the fragmented kingdom into a rich new province whose agricultural wealth and mineral resources instantly bolstered the depleted imperial treasury. This new territory provided not just income, but a release valve for the restless veterans. Instead of attempting another impossible siege on the shores of the Bosphorus, the seasoned fighters were busy chasing Visigothic remnants into the northern mountains, an effort that felt productive and far less likely to result in freezing to death or being incinerated by strange chemicals. To the east, the push into Transoxiana and Sind. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier demanded equal attention. Beyond Persia lay the rugged, often rebellious lands of Transoxiana, modern Central Asia, and the exotic territories of Sind, the Indian subcontinent. Here, the challenge was less about entrenched walls and more about nomadic resilience and geographic distance. While the Caliphate technically held the territory, the local potentates and Turkic groups were notoriously difficult to pin down. Under capable generals like Qutayba ibn Muslim before the siege, and later the generals stabilizing the area, the Caliphate systematically imposed its will. The goal was not mass conversion initially, but control of the immensely profitable Silk Road trade routes. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were brought firmly under Umayyad control, not just by force but by installing sophisticated irrigation systems and funding massive building projects that showcased the wealth and durability of the central authority. Imagine the contrast. While Leo III in Constantinople was wiping soot from his face and desperately calculating how many sacks of grain remained, the Umayyads were constructing vast, elaborate mosques in Central Asia and planning new harbors on the shores of the Iberian Peninsula. The message was clear: you tried to strike at the heart, but the body is too large, too decentralized, and too economically vital to be destroyed by a single failure. The empire might have paused its march west, but it certainly hadn't stopped its expansion everywhere else. The reigns following the administrative genius of Omar II, specifically those of Yazid II, and the lengthy, stabilizing tenure of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, who took power around 724 AD, were the true payoff of this strategic pivot. Hisham inherited an empire that, thanks to Omar II's fiscal prudence, was astonishingly wealthy. The flow of silver from the mines of Spain, the vast agricultural surplus of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the customs duties from the booming trade routes in the east provided a foundation of wealth that allowed the Umayyads to truly indulge in the trappings of a global hegemon. This was the age of magnificent desert palaces, opulent hunting lodges, and administrative centers built far from the suffocating heat of the capital. These structures, like the famous Qusayr Amra, were showcases of imperial power, decorated with stunning frescoes and elaborate bathhouses. They weren't just buildings, they were physical manifestations of a state that finally felt secure enough to relax and invest its resources into high culture, architecture, and pleasure. The Umayyads had mastered the art of statecraft. They could wage war when necessary, but more importantly, they could afford not to. The standardization of the dinar, the gold coin, and the dirham, the silver coin, originally implemented by earlier caliphs, solidified under Hisham, creating a remarkably stable currency that was trusted and accepted from the Pyrenees Mountains all the way to the Himalayas. This vast economic zone, managed from Damascus, facilitated an explosion of intellectual and commercial exchange. While Byzantium remained obsessively focused on maintaining the status quo, repairing walls, perfecting liquid fire, and ensuring their survival against the next inevitable invasion, the Islamic world was focused on the far more exciting prospect of becoming the center of global culture. Scholars in Damascus were translating Greek texts on philosophy and science. Jurists were debating nuanced points of law that governed millions of people, and architects were developing styles that would define civilization for 1,000 years. The Umayyad Caliphate, having survived the most dangerous military and logistical challenge ever mounted against it, did not shrink. Instead, it metabolized the shock of defeat and emerged stronger, turning its immense energy away from the difficult, intractable foe in Constantinople and toward the softer, richer targets awaiting organization elsewhere. It was the great historical irony of the 8th century. Byzantium survived by standing perfectly still, hardened by suffering and fortified by sheer technological refusal. The Umayyads, however, became a true superpower by learning that sometimes the most effective conquest is not achieved through fire and sword, but through the rigorous, unglamorous power of the tax receipt, the standardized coin, and the carefully calibrated, perfectly boring administrative ledger. The era of the warrior conqueror was waning. The age of the bureaucrat king had dawned, and that, naturally, is a far more entertaining story than any history book would lead you to believe.